Martin Buber, Tales of the Hasidim. Book 2, The Later Masters. Introduction. The period which followed the first 3 generations of Hasidism is usually treated as one of incipient decline, but that is an oversimplification of what really happened. Confronted by such a development, we must always ask what elements of the movement before us exhibit a deterioration which can, nevertheless, go hand in hand with the enrichment, ramification, and even strengthening of other elements. There is no doubt that the crude power characteristic of the outset of Hasidism lessened during this second epoch, which mainly occupies the first half of the 19th century. Though certain of the exponents of Hasidism lived past that time, the main outlines of the first Hasidic tidings and struggles become complicated or blurred, and the sacred passion to bring heaven and earth closer to each other often gives place to the kind of organized religiosity we can trace in every great religious movement which persists past the generations of awakening and revolt. But at the same time comes a variety and abundance of new spiritual life, which does not, it is true, deepen the basic ideas of Hasidism in any essential respect, but does expand the province in which these ideas can be realized and applies them to the problems of everyday life to a far greater extent than before. The form in which these ideas are expressed has less elemental vigor but often more brilliance. Aphorisms, parables, and symbolic fairy tales, which up to that time occurred only as the naive, witty, but unfinished improvisations of genius, achieve literary perfection. The real problems of the second period are not apparent in the sphere of the spirit and teachings of Hasidism, but in that of its inner structure. They emerge in 3 different sets of relationship: that of the Tzaddik to the congregation, of the Tzadikim and their congregations to one another, and that of the Tzaddik to his school. In this second period of Hasidism, all 3 relationships are occasionally affected by noteworthy and serious changes. It is common to both periods for the Tzaddik usually to be hidden at first, and only subsequently to reveal himself. That is to say, let it be known that heaven has called him to its service. In addition to this call, there generally is a teacher who appoints him to his office and vouches for him. In other words, the community receives its leader from on high, directly through the manifest grace of heaven that rests upon him, and indirectly through his election and appointment by his teacher, whose own vocation, in turn, provides the basis for this act. It is only when one of the great teachers dies and the question arises who among his disciples is to succeed him, and then only if there is neither agreement nor schism, that the Hasidim themselves make the decision. This is not done according to any prescribed formula, but always in a way suggested and determined by the current situation. If we are to believe legend, and the legendary incidents we are told of correspond to similar known incidents in the history of religion, a decision of this kind is always made and accepted as something mysterious. The congregation is fused to an unprecedented entity, and as such, feeling the will of heaven internally, as it were, dares to fulfill that will. In the second period, the instances of such decisions multiply. They occur both when a Tzaddik dies sonless, as well as when he leaves behind a son who is considered a candidate for the succession. A conversation which has been handed down to us is characteristic of this altered situation. It took place between Rabbi Mendel of Kotzk, a great and tragic figure, whom it would be more precise to include in the 4th generation, though he really belongs to the 5th, and young Mendel of Vorki, the son of his friend Rabbi Yitzhak of Vorki, 9 months after Yitzhak's death. The Rabbi of Kotzk is trying to discover who will succeed his friend, for Mendel has rather avoided becoming the successor than striven for that honor. The Rabbi of Kotzk asks, "What about the world?" That is to say, the congregation. His disciple replies, "The world stands." That is to say, the question of the succession has not yet been solved. Then the rabbi continues, "They say that you will take over the world." And young Mendel answers, "If that were so, I should have a feeling. In conclusion, the Tzaddik says, they say it is the Hasidim who make a rabbi. Thereupon, Mendel of Vorki replies, I was never eager to accept alms. By that he meant that he did not wish to receive the gift of heaven from the hands of the congregation, and that he did not recognize their authority, but kept to the great Hasidic tradition. What he is resisting in this way is expressed very clearly in a bitter jest uttered by Rabbi Mendel of Raimanov, a Tzaddik who lived during the time of the transition from the first period to the second. If 1,000 believing Hasidim were to gather around a block of wood, said he, it too would work miracles. It is obvious that he was using the word believing to mean superstitious. These Hasidim do not believe that heaven has chosen a Tzaddik and sent him to them, but that the congregation has the right to have a true Tzaddik, and therefore not merely receives, but can even make him. The natural consequence of such a point of view is that Tzadikim, whose aptitude for their vocation is dubious, multiply. One ought not to take the chair until one hears Elijah's call. This saying illustrates the stand of the true Tzadikim. The dubious think otherwise. A second problem rose from the fact that there was a large number of Tzadikim, but no superior authority, a multiplicity which must be understood as one of the chief bases of the Hasidic movement. Historically, Hasidism is the reply to the crisis in Messianism. The way to Hasidism, to the concentrated attempt to preserve the reality of God for the Jew, was paved by the extreme antinomian development of the Sabbatian movement, whose followers thought they could divest the God of Israel of his character, of teacher, of the right way, and still have a Jewish God. Jacob Frank's enterprise, which ran grotesquely amok and took the final leap into a kind of nihilism draped in mythology, had shown wakeful souls that not only sections of the Jewish people but the whole community was on the edge of the abyss, and this realization had led the most valuable forces to Hasidism. Bitter experience pointed to the necessity of preventing the people from again putting their faith in any single human. Hasidism succeeded in this. On the one hand, by setting up the classical picture of biblical eschatology, in contrast to the aftermath of the Sabbatian theology, by renewing the concept of the altogether human executor of the divine will to redemption. On the other hand, Hasidism repudiated every possible tendency in the direction of endowing a human being with divine attributes, as had happened in those last messianic movements. Not a speck of the idea of incarnation ever attached itself to the Baal Shem, either in regard to his teachings or to the legend which grew around him. But even more, out of a conscious or unconscious sense of danger, it does not matter which. The structure of the Hasidic community was fundamentally characterized by a multiplicity which could not merge into a unity. Every congregation was autonomous and subject to no superior authority. The Tzadikim were under no superior leadership. Even the great Maggid, who headed a Hasidic community composed of a number of congregations, did not desire to be anything but a teacher. While in the succeeding generations we find Tzadikim competing for higher rank, the rivalry between them being reflected by their congregations, no one laid serious claim to exclusive validity. Not until the second period did this rivalry degenerate into mutual exclusion. The most striking instance is the quarrel between Zanz, Rabbi Chaim of Zanz, and Sadagora, Rabbi Abraham Yaakov of Sadagora and his brothers, which revived the methods once prevalent in altercation between Hasidim and their adversaries, Mitnagdim, even to the point of ban and counterban. What lay behind all this becomes evident in the unmistakable utterances of the Rabbi of Zanz, who cited the legend of the rivalry between the sun and the moon, and the sun's statement that it is not possible for two kings to wear the same crown. Those Tzadikim who realized the danger took a firm stand against such deviations from the Hasidic way. It is from this point of view that we must interpret the words of Rabbi Hirsch of Zhaidichov, a distinguished disciple of the seer of Lublin, who said that for Hasidim to regard theirs as the only true rabbi is idol worship. But we also find utterances in which plurality is raised to an absolute, which verges on the ridiculous, as for example, when the grandson of a distinguished Hasidic thinker said that every Tzaddik should be the Messiah to his Hasidim. The third relationship, that of the Tzaddik to his school. In the beginnings of Hasidism, the idea of rivalry between master and disciple never entered the mind of either. On the one hand, the disciple's devotion to his master exerted so powerful a force over his entire life that the thought of acting against the will of his teacher could never occur to him. On the other hand, the teacher, far from seeing his pupils as potential rivals, made those he considered fit for such an office heads of congregations where they served the movement as his representatives, as it were. As an example of this, read how the great Maggid, in truly biblical fashion, invests Rabbi Menahem Mendel with belt and staff and appoints him rabbi. There was a change in the very next generation, toward the end of the first period. Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk, who succeeded to the great Maggid's teachings, would not suffer his disciples to lead congregations of their own during his lifetime. When one of them, who later became the seer of Lublin, nevertheless assumed such leadership, a deep and permanent tension resulted. Legend even has it that Rabbi Elimelech's curse had a fatal effect on those who became the followers of his disciple. But the same relationship, only in a more acute and complicated form, obtained between the seer of Lublin and certain of his disciples. It brought gloomy tragedy when the seer falsely accused the Yehudi, his noblest disciple, of competing with him, and finally, if we may trust the tradition, drove him to his death. There is an oral tradition that the seer said repeatedly that the Yehudi was above him, he walks on a higher plane than we, but that he, the seer, had been appointed to his place by Rabbi Elimelech, an utterance which is very strange when viewed in the light of all these occurrences, but undoubtedly reflects the speaker's consciousness. At this point, though a disciple's leading a congregation was disapproved, still it was endured. In the succeeding generation, however, it was generally accepted almost as law that a disciple should not found his own congregation during his teacher's lifetime. Thus, a fundamental principle of the Hasidic movement, one we might term the inner apostolate, is abandoned. The master no longer sends forth his tried and proven disciples to supplement his work of teaching and construction with their own, each in his autonomous domain. He keeps them chained to himself and his house, and thus prejudices the activities of the movement. These and similar phenomena are the reason for the sharp criticism which distinguished Tzadikim of the second period pronounced upon the Tzadikism of their time. After the Yehudi had spoken of the types of leaders who led former generations and were followed by the Tzadikim, he added, "That is why I sigh. I see that the present too will be corrupted. What will Israel do then?" Another Tzadik refuses to expound the Hasidic teachings, say Torah, because he notes that the instruction of certain Tzadikim no longer guards the original complete purity of the Hasidic teachings, and that lurking demons might fall upon the teaching and drag them into their realm. It is particularly significant that some descendants of great Tzadikim do not want to become rabbis, a son and a grandson of Rabbi Elimelech's, for instance. A Tzadik of the sixth generation, the grandson of a grandson of the great Maggid, gives vehement expression to his resentment at a decline which was already apparent. This was Rabbi Dov Beir of Leva, a son of the famous Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, who went so far as to leave the Hasidic camp for a time and fled to the camp of the enlightened. This was the incident which set off the quarrel between the followers of Zanz and those of Sadagora. Rabbi Dov Beir often told a story which ostensibly was about his ancestor, the great Maggid, but actually referred only to his and not the Maggid's situation. A tenant farmer, so he told, once came to the Maggid of Mezrich to ask his help in a matter having to do with his affairs. "Is it me you are asking?" the Maggid inquired. "Do you really mean me?" The man replied, "I ask the rabbi to pray for me in this matter." "Wouldn't it be better," said the Maggid, "if you were to ask me to teach you how to pray to God? Then you wouldn't have to come to me anymore." In these words, which could not by any stretch of the imagination have come from the lips of the great Maggid, but resemble similar utterances by Tzadikim of the second period, despair over the decline of Tzadikism has turned into doubt of its very basis. In the early days of Hasidism, the Tzaddik also guided his Hasidim to a direct relationship with God. But he did not believe that merely teaching people how to pray meant that the man who is an intermediary between heaven and earth could be dispensed with. For, according to the Hasidic concept, external help as such is not what matters. It is only the outer husk which makes an inner form of help possible. This idea emerges most clearly in a story told by Rabbi Shalom Shachna, the grandson of the great Maggid and the grandfather of the Rabbi of Leva. He tells how a tenant farmer came to him before the beginning of the Sabbath and confided his trouble, that one of his calves was ailing. And from his words, says the rabbi, I heard him imploring me, "You are a lofty soul, and I am a lowly soul. Lift me up to yourself." Thus, the expedient of external help is not to be abandoned in the least. For teaching how to pray cannot in itself be the true elevation, and the experience of being uplifted is not a unique event. It is by its very nature a process which is interrupted only by death and, according to a concept we occasionally encounter, not necessarily even then. Hasidism enters upon its decline when the Tzadikim no longer give their Hasidim inner help along with and through external help. For here, everything is based on the relationship between Tzadikim and Hasidim, a living relationship which is all-inclusive and penetrates to the innermost core. When that is lacking, then indeed the present too will be corrupted. The series of Tzadikim treated in this volume must needs begin with the descendants of the Maggid of Mezrich, with the Sadagora dynasty. This sequence is essentially different from the succession of the Maggid's disciples and the disciples of the disciples. Even his son Abraham, as we know from tales of the Hasidim, the early masters showed his definite opposition to him and his teachings by choosing the way of radical asceticism. Abraham's son, Shalom Shachna, died in 1802, swerved sharply from his father's path, without, however, returning to that of his grandfather. He was educated by Rabbi Nachman of Chernobyl, one of the most faithful disciples of the Baal Shem and the Maggid, and later married his granddaughter. Shalom expressed his striving toward innovation in his every act. His rich clothing and splendid manner set him apart from his environment. But these outward manifestations apparently symbolized a definite trend, and probably because of this, people like to say that his soul was a spark of King David's. When his father-in-law reproached him, he replied with the parable of the hen who hatched duck's eggs and then surveyed the swimming ducklings in great dismay. He emphatically rejected Nahum's miracle cures, for while he too wanted to help sufferers, it was to be with the strength of his soul and according to the needs of the moment, rather than through the usual magical procedures. To him, all help that came from the outside was only the point of departure and the husk of an inner help. He surrounded himself with a group of young men who were passionately devoted to him. The conflict between them and their father's generation flared up time and again, and that according to their ideas was, as it should be, for Rabbi Shalom, so we are told, had said, "That which is a result of good cannot take place without opposition." There is even a peculiar story, which I heard in a version still stranger than the one preserved in writing, that Rabbi Shalom made himself appear sinful in public for the purpose of outwitting Satan. For Satan was considered sovereign over Israel in exile, but the secret of redemption was also supposed to have been confided to him. And so Shalom pretended to be sinful in order to gain Satan's confidence and worm the secret out of him. One is tempted to interpret this as an after effect of the Sabbatian tenet of holy sin. There are several indications that Rabbi Shalom strove to be more than a tzaddik. One is the answer he gave Rabbi Baruch, a grandson of the Baal Shem. When Baruch, a proud and imperious man, visited him and suggested, "Let us both lead the world." World, in this connection, referred to the Hasidic community as the center of Israel. He replied, "I can lead the world by myself." But in saying this, he was not thinking of reviving the office of exilarch, as has been supposed. His words sprang from the belief in the potential messianic mission of a family, in which the potential could become actual in every generation. Like his father, Rabbi Shalom died young, and before his death had a vision which he told to his son Israel, which allows a deep understanding of this belief. He saw a Tzaddik sitting in one of the halls of heaven. On the table in front of him lay a magnificent crown shaped out of his teachings and his holiness. But the Tzaddik was not permitted to place the crown on his head. "I have told you about it," Rabbi Shalom added, "because someday you may need to know it." Ines, his son, Rabbi Israel of Lizhensk, died in 1850, not only adopted his father's manner, but carried it further, so that the ceremonial and ritual of his household made it appear like the court of a priest-king. He himself put into words the dynastic character implicit in his mode of life, for he compared Rabbi Abraham Yehoshua Heschel, the old Rav of Apt, who was generally accepted as the leader of his generation, to Moses the teacher, but himself to Solomon the king, and the Rabbi of Apt himself dubbed him a king in Israel. The throngs which swarmed to his house honored him as such. It was in this light that his activities were reported to the Tsarist regime, which arrested him as a leader of the Jews, regarded by them as their king. After 2 years in prison, for the most part in Kiev, he was liberated, and soon afterward fled to Galicia. After much wandering and travail, he settled in Sadagora, Bukovina, which became the goal of mass pilgrimages. But many Tzadikim came as well, especially the younger Tzadikim, paid homage to him and delighted in his conversation. Scarcely one among them, however, became his disciple. He did not wish to bind anyone to himself. He wanted visitors who hung on his words, not disciples who entailed a sustained mutual relationship. Like the great Maggid, Rabbi Israel was a distinguished expounder of the Torah in the Hasidic manner, but his homilies are not parts of a unified thinking life. They are sudden lightning conceits, not the work of a fragmentist, like those of the great Maggid, but of an aphorist, for they flash with the luxuriance of multifaceted jewels, while the works of the fragmentist show the deep sparkle of plain-cut stones. Modern Western civilization would have called the Rabbi of Lizhensk a brilliant improviser, and weighed in the scale of values of that civilization. He was certainly a genius, but he was no longer the vessel and the voice of the religious spirit. His 6 sons were gifted epigoni. They too still had something of the spiritual world of the great Maggid, but it no longer developed into mature personal form. Almost all of them had followers, drew crowds, held court, had congregations and influence. Not one of them had disciples. The noblest of his sons, Rabbi David Moshe of Chortkov, died in 1903, was tender and humane to all creatures. In my youth, I spent several summers not far from his home, but I did not make his acquaintance. Another of his sons, whom I have already mentioned, Rabbi Dov Ber, named for his great-grandfather, was first considered the most notable of the 6 and attracted the greatest number of people. Later, he joined the so-called enlightened group and wrote letters in the nature of manifestos against superstition. This phase, however, lasted only a short while. He returned to Sadagora and remained there from that time on in a sort of half-voluntary confinement. His life merely expressed the situation. The king's highway had come to a dead end. Since Rabbi Mendel of Vitebsk did not found a school in Palestine, the first place among the disciples of the Maggid must be assigned to Rabbi Shmelka of Nikolsburg, a great preacher, singer of songs, and friend to all humanity. None of his disciples ever equaled him in preaching, but Rabbi Yitzhak Asik of Kalev fell heir to his gift of song, while Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov inherited his love for mankind. Rabbi Yitzhak Asik of Kalev Nagikalo, in the north of Hungary, d. 1828, came from a Hungarian village and absorbed its peasant vitality in his childhood. Tradition has it that he tended geese. He not only used the tunes he had learned from the herdsmen for sacred hymns or psalms, such as By the Waters of Babylon, but without having to make too many changes, converted some of the texts into Jewish mystical verses. The sadness of the pastoral songs is turned into the suffering in exile. Their yearning for love into the longing for the divine presence. The unknown melodies of Rabbi Shmelki played an important part in this transformation. But the Rabbi of Kalev's songs were said to have been even more sensuous and enchanting, probably because of the folk elements which entered into them. His deep attachment to the folk element is illustrated by the curious fact that he always recited the Passover Haggadah in Hungarian. It is told that on the evening of the Seder, Rabbi Shmelka could hear all his disciples reciting the Haggadah in their various homes far from Nikolsburg, all except the Rabbi of Kalev, because he was speaking Hungarian. Another instance of his love for the folk element is the story that he had inherited the melody of the hymn Mighty in Dominion from the great Maggid, who had learned it from a shepherd. But, so the tale continues, the tune had been in exile with the shepherd, for originally the Levites had sung it in the temple. This tune, incidentally, returned to the family of the Maggid via the Rabbi of Kalev, if the tradition is correct, for Rabbi David Moshe of Chortkov was fond of singing it. Many other songs of the Rabbi of Kalev spread among his Hasidim. There was Rabbi Chaim of Zons, for example, who on a Friday evening, when he had paced around the platform in the synagogue 7 times, would sing the Rabbi of Kalev's song of yearning for the reunion with the bride, the divine presence, until his bodily strength failed him because of the vehemence of his ecstasy. Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov died in 1807, followed his teacher from one Polish village to the next, and from Poland to Nikolsburg. Legend links him with Rabbi Shmelka in Miracle Tales. We need hardly touch upon him in this introduction, since the stories in themselves suffice to give a clear picture of him. His soul developed the gift of the helpful love which Rabbi Shmelka had roused within him to a level of perfection unusual even in Hasidism, a movement so rich in those who knew how to love. A ravishing spontaneity quickened his love and zeal toward both man and beast. In his case, the paradox of the commandment to love one's neighbor as oneself seems resolved. Can one love in obedience to command? And yet even the Rabbi of Sasov came up against inner obstacles. He could not love those malicious or self-assured men who disrupt the world. But that was just the sort of thing his teacher used to speak of, that one must love every soul because it is a part of God, or rather, that one cannot help loving a soul the moment one grows aware that it is a part of God. And so, since he was very serious in his love for God, the Rabbi of Sasov came to love his creatures more and more perfectly. The true meaning of the command to love manifests itself in the inner obstacles to its fulfillment and in their overcoming. In order to show the Rabbi of Sasov's influence on his immediate circle, the next section of this volume deals with his disciple, Rabbi Mendel of Kosov, died in 1825, whose life and work continue the line of love for humanity. He is said to have made especially radical formulations of the belief that the love for one's neighbor is only another side of the love of God. An instance of this is an interpretation he once gave to the words in the scriptures, "Love thy neighbor as thyself. I am the Lord." He explained, if a man loves his fellow, the divine presence rests with them. And, on another occasion, the union of loving neighbors effects unity in the upper world. We know that his son Chaim never ceased in his efforts to have his Hasidim live together like good neighbors, to know, help, keep one another company, and love one another. In Tales of the Hasidim, the early masters, I included the Maggid of Koznitz and the Seer of Lublin, both disciples of Rabbi Elimelech, because they were first disciples of the great Maggid, and may thus be assigned to the 3rd generation. 2 others, Rabbi Abraham Yehoshua Heschel of Apt, died in 1825, and Rabbi Menahem Mendel of Rymanov, died in 1815, belong in this volume. It is said that before he died, Rabbi Elimelech left his tongue's judging power to the Rabbi of Apt, and his spirit's guiding power to the Rabbi of Rymanov. The Rabbi of Apt was noted for his judicious character. He discharged the office of judge and arbiter among the Hasidim and even the Tzadikim of his time. It was through error and effort that he arrived at his profound conception of true justice. He started out with what we usually call justice, that is to say, with the wish to be just. But then he learned step by step that human justice as such fails when it attempts to exceed the province of a just social order and encroaches on that of just human relationships. He learned that God's justice is not in the same category as his love, which is the perfection of an attribute we can at least endeavor to imitate, but is something enigmatic, which defies comparison with anything men call justice and law. Man should be just within the bounds of his social order, but when he ventures beyond it, out on the high seas of human relationships, he is sure to be shipwrecked, and then all he can do is to save himself by clinging to love. The turning point in the life of the Rabbi of Apt is, very probably, the incident related in this book of how he publicly reproved a woman of loose morals, but then, comparing his own attitude with that of God, was overcome and became a changed man. But he did not regard his way to love as that of one individual living on earth. He saw it in connection with the migrations of his soul, and realized that he had the task of perfecting that love during their course. Rabbi Mendel of Raimanov differed from the Rabbi of Apt both in his character and his life. He had fallen heir to his teacher's ability to organize, but practiced it within narrower bounds. Of the three circles which surround the Tzaddik, the disciples, the congregation, and the transients, he was most concerned with the second. He issued laws to his congregation as if it were a state, and it was more real to him than the state. He did not presume to be just. He simply watched over the just order of those in his charge. When he was forced to reprove, his words penetrated like a natural force to the very heart of the incident which had evoked his censure. And so when it was necessary to preserve custom and maintain order, he who was noted for his sobriety could rise to heights of archaic majesty. This happened when, to rouse and fuse his congregation, which was, as congregations always are, in danger of becoming stolid, he spoke to them as God's instituted deputy, liberated them from the compulsion exerted by the Torah, and left them free to make their choice anew. To his disciples, his power over the word made him the model of a man whose every utterance reflects his sense of responsibility. Rabbi Zevi Hirsch of Raimanov died in 1846. The disciple who became Rabbi Mendel's successor was the real self-made man among the Tzadikim of the second period. He was first apprenticed to a tailor and then became a servant in Rabbi Mendel's house. There he practiced the wisdom and art of serving on so high a plane that the Tzaddik soon recognized him as a rare human vessel, capable of receiving teachings. He accepted young Hirsch as his disciple, but even in that capacity he went on serving the Tzaddik. He continued his studies for 12 years after his master's death, and then, to everyone's surprise, assumed the succession. He was soon recognized by the other Tzadikim and occupied a powerful position of a particular kind. Though at times he conducted himself in a haughty manner, he was very humble at heart and often said of his simple and at the same time profound sermons that he only uttered what he had been told to say. Sometimes he could not even remember a sermon when he had finished preaching it. It is also noteworthy that he often asked substantial amounts of money from persons who came to request his intercession. In such cases, he named an exact sum, whose numerals were apparently chosen for their mystical significance. On the other hand, he was in the habit of distributing among the needy whatever money he had in the house. It was a sort of redistribution of goods, which he practiced among his Hasidim, obviously prompted by the feeling that it was his mission to direct superfluous possessions to where they were needed. Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin, who was known for his great power in prayer, founded a school of ecstatic praying. His most renowned disciple, who developed his teaching of giving up one's very life in prayer, was Rabbi Uri of Strelisk, died in 1826, called the Seraph. In this connection, ecstatic prayer is not a merely personal transaction. It includes both the Tzaddik and his Hasidim. Almost all of Rabbi Uri's Hasidim were poor, but not one of them turned to him in order to attain well-being. All they wanted was to pray together with him. to pray as he prayed, and like him, to give away their life in prayer. The impression of his marvelous praying was transferred to their whole relationship to him, which became the glorification of a visionary. They really regarded him as a seraph. One Hasid tells how he could see that the rabbi had more than one face, another that the rabbi grew taller and taller before his eyes, until he reached up into heaven. The Hasidim relate that once when the synagogue had been polluted by the impure prayers of the Sabbatians, his mighty prayers made it burn to the ground the very next evening. But they also tell that the workday week did not begin until he had said the benediction of separation, Havdalah, at the close of the Sabbath. Until then, the keys to hell were in his hand, and the souls released over the Sabbath could hover in the atmosphere. Before his death, Rabbi Uri, ordained Rabbi Yehuda Zevi of Stettin, died in 1844, to the succession by the laying on of hands, recalling the ordination of Joshua by Moses. Legend has it that he too had possession of the keys to hell over the Sabbath, but the motif is elaborated. All the night after the Sabbath, a Hasid saw him standing at an open window, still dressed in his Sabbath clothes, and holding in his hand a great key which he could not bear to lay aside. All the while, swarms of evil angels lurked around him, waiting for morning when his strength would fail. It was his custom to take the ritual bath at night in a river outside the town, and it was said that while he stood in the water, he would recite the entire book of Psalms. The most outstanding feature of Rabbi Yehuda Zevi's teaching was his emphatic affirmation of the unity of the attributes of God, the unity of God's rigor and his mercy. Rabbi Yehuda's son, Rabbi Abraham of Stettin, died in 1865, left the world a significant teaching of human unity. That man can bring about such unity between his faculties that each of his senses can substitute for another and take over its function. Besides Rabbi Uri of Strelisk, Rabbi Shlomo of Karlin had a second distinguished disciple. Rabbi Mordecai of Lekovitz died in 1811, who added new and concrete features to the teaching of giving one's life to prayer. He taught that he who prays should give himself up to his Lord with every word he utters, and he illustrated this by the parable of the legendary bird whose song of praise bursts its own body. Man's entire physical being must enter into every word of his prayer, so that it may even rise from his heel. It is said that Rabbi Mordecai's lung was torn by the fervor of his praying, but his whole attitude toward life was joyful. Only in joy can the soul be truly raised to God, and he who wishes to serve God with devotion and divine light and joy and willingness must have a spirit that is bright and pure and clear and a body that is full of life. Rabbi Mordecai's son, Rabbi Noah of Lekovitz, died in 1834, continued along his father's lines, though he was more worldly in his outlook. But even among the utterances of Rabbi Noah's grandson, Rabbi Shlomo Hayim of Kaidanov, died in 1862, we still find sayings informed with the energy of the rabbi of Karlin's teachings on prayer. Rabbi Shlomo's school reached a late peak in a man who was first Rabbi Mordecai's and subsequently Rabbi Noah's disciple. Rabbi Moshe of Kobrin died in 1858. I do not hesitate to count this little-known man among the few late-born great men which the Hasidic movement produced in the very midst of its decline. While he did not enrich the teaching, his life and words, and the unity between his life and his words, lent it a very personal, refreshingly vital expression. 3 sayings suffice to give the gist of his philosophy. You shall become an altar before God. There is nothing in the world which does not contain a commandment, and just as God is limitless, so his service is limitless. I will. These teachings are integrated with a life which, by imaging and exemplifying them, sometimes recalls the early masters of Hasidism. For the rest, what is told about him in this book requires no further supplementation or explanation. Rabbi Chaim Meir Yehiel of Mogielnica died in 1849, the grandson of the Maggid of Koznitz, was the most notable among the disciples of that holy man of suffering, who prophesied from the depths of his suffering. Other Tzadikim besides his grandfather were his teachers, namely, the Rabbi of Apt and the seer of Lublin, and he was also close to the seer's disciple, the Yehudi of Pija, who had so many enemies. Chaim collected teachings without becoming an eclectic, for though he was not an independent thinker, he had a strong and independent soul which melted all matter received from the outside in the crucible of his own feeling and experience. Two of his utterances serve to characterize him. I have no use for spiritual rungs without the garment of the body, and I never wanted to win anything without working for it myself. He had insight into himself and liked to tell his Hasidim what was happening within his soul. He enjoyed telling in any event and talked readily and freely. The relationship between him and his Hasidim was one of great intimacy. Every gesture of his made a lasting impression on them, and they served him with love. The disciple for whom his influence was most fruitful was Rabbi Yisachar of Wolborz, died in 1876. The rest of this volume gives the story of the school of Lublin and the schools it influenced, including the significant schools of Psisha and Kotzk. These developed under the influence of Lublin, especially of the great personality of the seer, and yet in opposition to both. Tales of the Hasidim. The early masters included 10 disciples of Mezrich. Similarly, this volume treats 9 of the many disciples of the seer of Lublin. They are Rabbi David of Lelov, died in 1813, Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum of Ohel Uheli in Hungary, d. 1841, Rabbi Yisachar Ber of Radoshitz, died in 1843, Rabbi Shlomo Leib of Lenchno, died in 1843, Rabbi Naphtali of Ropchitz, died in 1827, Rabbi Shalom of Beltzi died in 1855. Rabbi Zevi Hirsch of Zaydachov died in 1831. Rabbi Yaakov Yitzhak of Bzhisha, known as the Yehudi, died in 1813. And Rabbi Simcha Bunim of Pijisha died in 1827. For the sake of interrelatedness, I have taken them in this non-chronological sequence, and I have not included Rabbi Menahem Mendel of Kotzk, although he was for a time a disciple of the seer, but have dealt with him in connection with the school of Psisha, because he himself never failed to stress that he belonged to Psisha rather than to the school of Lublin. David of Lelov was one of the most lovable figures in Hasidism. He was wise and at the same time childlike, open to all creatures, yet retaining his secret heart, alien to sin, and yet protecting the sinner from his persecutors. He is a notable example of a tzaddik who could not become what he was until the truth of Hasidism had freed him from his ascetic outlook on the world. He owed this liberation to Rabbi Elimelech. The seer of Lublin was his next teacher, with whom he kept faith throughout his life, even though he was, and could not but be, opposed to him in basic issues, while siding wholeheartedly with his friend, the Yehudi, in the quarrels between Lublin and Psisha. For a long time, he refused to be regarded as a tzaddik, in spite of the fact that he had numerous reverent followers who compared this unpretentious man to King David, probably with more reason than other tzaddikim. For a considerable period of his life, he worked in his little shop and frequently sent customers to other shopkeepers who were poorer than he. He liked to travel through the country, visit unknown village Jews, and warm their hearts with his brotherly words. In the small towns, he gathered children about him, took them for drives, and played and made music with them. In the marketplace, he fed and watered animals which had been left untended, as the rabbi of Sasov had done before him. He was particularly fond of horses and went into vehement explanations of how senseless it is to beat them. Because he was more devoted to his own family than to mankind at large, he declared that he was not worthy to be called a tzaddik. He believed that his most important mission was to keep peace among men. That was why, so tradition has it, he had been granted the power of making peace wherever there was enmity by his mere prayer. He taught that one should not reprimand and exhort persons whom one wishes to turn to God, but associate with them like a good friend, quiet the tumult in their hearts, and through love lead them to recognize God. This was the method by which he himself led to the right way many who had strayed. Outstanding among these was a famous physician, Dr. Bernhard, whom the Rabbi of Lelov took to the seer of Lublin, where the doctor developed into a Hasid living on a very high rung. Rabbi David's own life provided the conclusive example for his teachings. Everything he did, every day and every hour, said Rabbi Yitzhak of Vorki, who studied with him for a time, was the statute and the word of the Torah. As Rabbi Elimelech freed the Rabbi of Lelov from the bonds of asceticism, so Rabbi Elimelech's disciple, the seer of Lublin, freed Rabbi Moshe Teitelbaum from his preoccupation with scholarliness, which isolated him from the world. The seer recognized in his soul the true flame, which only lacked the proper fuel. Whoever has that flame is already a Hasid at heart, no matter how much he may be opposed to the Hasidic way. Many things had prepared Rabbi Moshe for this way, among others his curious dreams of which we have records, some from the time of his youth. In these dream experiences, including encounters with the masters of the Kabbalah from bygone ages, whom he watched at their secret work, he learned to realize how little good deeds avail if the man who does them is not devoted to God with all his soul, and that both paradise and hell are within the human spirit. At that point, the seer became his teacher and taught him the true Hasidic joy, but it was not easy for him to reach that state. It was said that Rabbi Moshe was a spark from the soul of the prophet Jeremiah. All his life, he had sorrowed very deeply for the destruction of the temple and of Israel. When he learned joy, his hope in the Messiah triumphed over his sorrow, for this hope had an extraordinary sensuous force. No other Tzaddik is reported to have had such vigorous and concrete faith in the Messiah at every instant of his life. Rabbi Yisachar Ber of Radoshitz was known far and wide as a miracle worker, and especially famed for his miraculous cures. Chief among these were his cures of dibukim, of those who were possessed by demons, and they even gained him the name of the Little Baal Shem. He seems to have had this tendency toward the miraculous from youth on, although for a long time he did not venture to try out his inner powers and was known only as a shy and quiet man. We are told a characteristic incident of his youth, that he accompanied Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sassoff on a journey and suggested to Rabbi Moshe Leib his own magical methods, of which he himself was not yet aware. But still, stranger than this is the fact that he, who went from one Tzaddik to another, and after leaving the seer, finally attached himself to the Yehudi, kept his reverence for miracles intact even with this new teacher, the very air around whom was hostile to the miraculous. The tradition affords some explanation for this, for we are told that when the Yehudi's son fell ill, the father himself turned to Rabbi Yisachar Ber, whose slumbering healing powers he had apparently divined and now decided to actualize. Without any faith in his own gift, in the urgent need of the moment, Rabbi Yisachar took the child in his arms, laid it in the cradle, rocked it, prayed, and succeeded in healing it. Many years later, when the school of Pazisha had produced the last great Hasidic school, that of Kotzk, with its atmosphere of tragedy, and the Hasidim in both camps, Kotzk and Radoshitz, were opposing one another, Rabbi Yisachar is said to have uttered a paradox, which defined the principle of Kotzk as being the surrender of one's own will before the will of God, and that of Radoshitz as holding to one's own will, which also springs from the will of God. The saying was, if you cannot get across it, you must get across it nevertheless. The followers of the Rabbi of Kotzk, however, claimed that in Kotzk they were taught to bring their hearts closer to their Father in heaven, while in Radoshitz the attempt was made to bring our Father in heaven closer to the heart of the Jews. By this they meant that, instead of striving up to God in all his greatness and austerity, the school of Radoshitz was trying to make him familiar to man by way of miracles. This reminds us of what Rabbi Yisachar himself once said. When one of his most promising disciples asked him why he worked miracles and if it would not be better to purify the soul, he replied that he had been sent to make the Godhead known to the world. Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk was just as unique, though in a different way. He was much praised for his extreme cleanliness because it symbolized his entire mode of life. It is told that he never looked at a coin and never touched one with his fingers, that he never put out his hand to receive anything, not even when any of the Tzadikim who were his teachers viz. Rabbi Mendel of Rymanov, the seer of Lublin, and the Yehudi offered him something to eat from his own plate, as the Tzadikim often did to their dearest followers, and that he never spoke any idle words or listened to any idle speech. Even in his youth, he made a characteristic comment on the verse in Psalms that God will not despise a broken heart, but it must, at the same time, be whole. And it is also characteristic that whenever he spoke of the coming of the Messiah, he described the great feeling of shame that would prevail everywhere. Because of his holiness, which, though secluded, was sympathetic to all creatures, he was regarded as one of the epiphanies of the suffering Messiah. Once he himself said of Messiah the son of Joseph, who according to the tradition was to be killed, that is no longer the case. He will die of the sufferings of Israel. He too had enemies among the other Tzadikim. The leader of the fight which was waged against him when he remained faithful to the school of Pizhisha was a man who differed from him in all fundamental respects. He was Rabbi Naphtali of Ropchitz, who had been taught by Rabbi Elimelech of Lizhensk, and later by his four great disciples, the Rabbi of Apt, the Maggid of Koznitz, Rabbi Mendel of Rymanov, and above all the seer of Lublin. We hardly know of another Tzaddik whose soul harbored such a mass of contradictions as did that of Rabbi Naphtali of Ropchitz. But if we consider them all together, they are by no means formless and chaotic, but give the picture of a real human figure. He introduces into the Hasidic world a type not uncommon among the distinguished intellectuals of the modern era, a mixture of irony and yearning, skepticism and belief, ambition and humility. From his youth on, he was given to jests, many of them bitter, and to all manner of pranks, including some that were really malicious. In his youth, he reflected on his own endowments with extreme pride. In his age, with doubts verging on despair. He once observed that his teacher, Rabbi Mendel of Rymanov, was holy and knew nothing of cleverness, and added, "So how can he understand what I am like?" On another occasion, when the seer of Lublin grew impatient with his eternal jesting and reminded him that the verse in the scripture reads, "Thou shalt be wholehearted with the Lord thy God," and not, "Thou shalt be clever with the Lord thy God," Naphtali gave the following bold reply, which is utterly out of keeping with the original fundamental point of view of Hasidism. It requires great cleverness to be wholehearted with the Lord. They did met. But after he himself had become a rabbi, there are more and more quite different reports of him. A number of stories told in this volume, such as The Watchman, The Morning Prayer, Leader and Generation, and above all, A Wish, the tale of his desire to be reincarnated as a cow, testifies to what had taken place and was still taking place in his soul. A conversation of his with Rabbi Meir of Stabnitz suggests a conclusion, though rather general, which Rabbi Naphtali drew from his life experience. When he met Rabbi Meir, who had been his fellow pupil in Lublin, and had in the meantime become to a certain extent the seer's successor, he told him that from now on the Hasidim should stay at home and study rather than go to Tzadikim. Rabbi Meir answered, "Do not worry, God will provide. If we are not able to lead the community, other and abler men will appear and be the leaders," a reply not, however, confirmed by later events. Together with Rabbi Naphtali of Ropchitz, we must consider his disciple, Rabbi Hayyim of Zans, died in 1876, who, of all the distinguished Talmudic scholars among the Hasidim, was probably the one that continued the old line of study with the most energy, or, to use a curious simile, attributed to him, undertook to turn the garment, which had already been turned, back to its original side. But we must not suppose that he attempted the synthesis which the earlier periods of the movement had tried to effect again and again. This synthesis seems to have been renounced, for though Rabbi Chaim emphasizes that in the final analysis, teaching and service are the same thing, he admits that as far as he is concerned in learning, there is nothing in the world but the Torah, and in praying nothing but service. He was a master in Talmudic debate, as well as in ecstasy, and no less distinguished for his generous charities and his deep knowledge of human nature. But he did not approach the great Tzadikim in certain all-important qualities, for he lacked the unity of soul, and the unity of a figure shaped by the unity of the soul. Many great men of the later generations are characterized by the fact that they have everything except the basic unity of everything. Yehezkel of Shenyava, a son of the Rabbi of Zanz, was a living protest against this trend. It is told of him that he did not want to preach sermons about the scriptures, but would only read aloud from the Torah. One of his comments on his father was that Rabbi Chaim had the soul of Abel, but of himself he said that the good element in Cain's soul had entered into his. Another of his sayings, which has been handed down to us, is that every tzaddik comes across men more devout than he among those who follow him. Only those men are not aware of it themselves. The profuse legendary material at my disposal did not yield what I should call a comprehensive picture of Rabbi Shalom of Belz, the famous tzaddik and founder of a dynasty. But certain of his traits are so remarkable that I cannot omit him. Two motifs emerge with peculiar clarity. One is that of confession. Rabbi Shalom had his Hasidim tell him all the alien thoughts which passed through their minds, that is, all the temptations of fantasy which prevented them from concentrating on prayer. He listened to their confessions with intense activity, and this reciprocal relation accomplished the complete liberation of the Hasidim. The other motif has to do with marriage. It is well known that in circles of devout men, not merely the presence of women in general, but even that of their own wives, was regarded as a diverting factor. This effect was not, however, attributed to the nature of woman as such, but to original sin, and that part of it in particular which was due to the female element. In the case of the Rabbi of Belz, original sin seems to have been conquered. We see him sitting with his wife, like Adam and Eve, in paradise before the fall, when woman was still man's helpmeet with all her being. The original state of creation is restored. Rabbi Hirsch of Zhaidachov, who studied not only with the seer but also with the rabbis of Sasov and Koznitz, presents a new and unique situation. Together with his brothers and nephews, he formed a family, which was, at the same time, a school whose leader he was. A story told about one of the 5 brothers demonstrates the inner connection existing in this circle. It is about one of the brothers who, when the eldest, Rabbi Hirsch, was very sick, offered himself to heaven in his place because the world needs him more, and his sacrifice was accepted. Not only in his work, but in his everyday life, Rabbi Hirsch was the true Kabbalist among the disciples of the seer of Lublin. He never raised a glass of water to his lips without going through a special mystical concentration, kavanah. Since he had no self-confidence, he feared even after the age of 40 that he might be dominated by the planet Venus, in whose sphere good and evil mingle. The fact that so many Hasidim came to study with him also filled him with misgivings. Could Satan have a hand in it? This doubt assailed him because he took everything very seriously, including the relationship between outer and inner help, which he felt he must give to each of his Hasidim. But how could he give really personal attention to every individual in such a crowd? His rejection of any kind of supremacy, of any exclusive claim for himself or any other tzaddik, is closely tied to this general attitude. He believed that a Hasid who thought that his was the only true rabbi was an idolater, and that all that mattered was for everyone to find the rabbi fitted to his character and to his particular needs, the proper rabbi to give him individual help. Rabbi Yehuda Zevi of Rosdol died in 1847. A nephew of Rabbi Hirsch developed the problem of the tzaddik, which his uncle had newly posed, in connection with his own self-doubting. He felt that he lacked the power the great Tzadikim of earlier times possessed, the power to change the world. The determining principle of his own soul was, he discovered, a kind of yielding of his own, so to speak, space, a space-making. He called this element nothingness, and believed that it too was necessary for the existence of the world. Rabbi Yitzhak Isaac of Zhaidachov died in 1873. Another nephew of Rabbi Hirsch did not make any greater claims for the Tzaddik, but stressed the positive factor in his relationship to the Hasidim in two ways. First, by his view that all human relationships, hence those of Tzaddik and Hasidim as well, are based on a mutual give and take. And secondly, by interpreting the frequently misunderstood moral influence of the Tzaddik on the Hasid as an action which is not independent but conditioned by and included in the religious operation. On the whole, we may say that the school of Zhaidachov substantially contributed the critical evaluation of the entire sphere of relationship existing between Tzaddik and Hasidim, and to their new and more precise delimitation. The school of Bzisha, which originated in that of Lublin, and the school of Kotzk, the offspring of that of Bzisha, present a large, independent, communal structure. But we cannot properly understand the salient feature of these two schools without knowing that of their founder, the Yehudi. Like his master, the Yehudi was called Yaakov Yitzchak, but since it was not fitting to use his teacher's name in his teacher's entourage, he is said to have been known as the Yehudi, that is to say, the Jew. This became so popular that later on other Tzadikim addressed the rabbi of Bzisha simply as Holy Jew. But the name is symbolic as well and points to the special character of the man. Even as a boy, Yehudi refused to pray at stated intervals and in the company of others. Neither rebukes nor blows were of any avail. But then his father noticed that after the house of prayer had been closed, the boy climbed over the roof and in through a window to say his prayer, and did this day after day. As a youth, he liked to pray in a granary where no one could see him. In those days, he already had the reputation of being a great Talmudic scholar, but one who knew nothing of the service of the heart. It was generally supposed that he did not take the bath of immersion, for he was never seen in any of the groups of 10 or more who descended the 90 steps to the ice-cold pool. They went together in order to relieve the weirdness of the long, slippery stair, and also to light a fire and warm the water a little. But the Yehudi went alone at midnight, immersed himself without making a fire, returned as secretly as he had come, and studied the Kabbalah. At dawn, his young wife sometimes found him lying unconscious over his book. His wife's parents lived in the city of apartment. At that time, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov resided in the same city. He took an interest in the youth, became fond of him, and had a profound influence on his sensitive and reticent soul. Presently, Rabbi Abraham Yehoshua Heschel of Apt also discovered the greatness of Yehudi's soul. For many years he taught children in various villages. Then he was filled with a yearning for death which he regarded as the perfection of being. He did not know whether this yearning was divine truth or self-delusion. He sought support and leadership, and it is said that Rabbi David of Lelov took him to the seer of Lublin. There, so we are told, he was received like one who has been expected, and a feeling of deep calm came over him. When we remember the restlessness of his youth, we can understand what he meant by saying that in Lublin he learned to fall asleep. But the seer was not like his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich. He did not have the same great clarity which evoked the confidence of those he educated. The Maggid of Mezrich helped the disciples under his care to build up the substance of their life, each out of his own particular elements. The seer lived in the world of his own spiritual urges, the greatest of which was his seeing. His humility, though passionate like all his other qualities, impelled him time and again to strike a compromise between his personal world and the world at large. Yet he could not really understand a human being like the Yehudi or the premises of his nature, for he lacked the one essential to such a man, the confidence of one's soul in another. The Yehudi, in turn, could never realize this failing in the seer's personality. That was why the relationship between the two was one of both intimacy and remoteness. Finally, the Yehudi founded a congregation of his own, a step which, though taken at his teacher's suggestion, provided fuel for the seer's suspicions. With the help of Rabbi Bunam, who had been a fellow student of the Yehudis and had then become his disciple, this congregation grew into the school of Psisha. But the focal point in the Yehudi's life continued to be his disturbed and bitter relations with the Rabbi of Lublin, and time and again he felt a compulsion to bridge the unbridgeable gap. He started out on his own way in the shadow of this conflict, and after years of struggle, the people flocked to him. "Turn!" he cried to them. "Turn quickly, for the day is near. There is not time for new migrations of souls. Redemption is close at hand." What he meant by this was that redemption was so imminent that people had no more time to strive toward perfection in new incarnations, that they had to take the decisive step now, with one stupendous effort, in the great turning. The Yehudi kept on the other side of the realm of magic which the seer and his friends entered at that time, in an attempt to reach the messianic sphere by affecting current events. He did not wish to hasten the end, but to prepare man for the end. Rabbi Uri of Strelisk, the Seraph, said of him that he wanted to bring a new way down to men, to fuse teaching and prayer into one service. He went on to say that that had never happened before, but I think that it had happened in the beginnings of the Hasidic innovation, but had by that time disappeared. And Rabbi Uri continued, "But he died in the midst of his work and did not complete it." The gravest accusation the Yehudi's enemies proffered against him was that he did not pray at the prescribed hours, but waited until he was filled with the desire to pray. This was, however, nothing but the first necessary consequence of his will to concentrate. He did not have the opportunity to draw the further consequences, for he died in the fullness of his strength before he was 50, some 2 years before his teacher. According to one legend, the seer had bidden him die, so that through the Yehudi, the seer might learn from the upper world what next step to take in the great messianic enterprise. According to another legend, the upper world gave him the choice of either dying himself or having his teacher die, and he chose. There is still another version which suggests that the secret of his youth, which had expressed itself in a yearning for death, was at that time renewed on a higher plane, and that the highest unification is bound up with bodily death when it is performed by those who are uprooted, and this late bloom of Hasidism no longer had any true roots. The story of his death is enveloped in more mystery than that of any other Tzaddik. He himself once formulated the teaching which took shape in his life in a few terse words, which are a commentary on the verse in the scriptures. "Justice, justice shalt thou follow." They were, "We ought to follow justice with justice and not with unrighteousness." In this volume, the passages about the Yehudi are supplemented by stories selected from a mass of kindred material about his sons and grandsons, intended to show that here a peculiarity of character is preserved through several generations. Rabbi Simcha Bunam of Psisha was the greatest of the Yehudi's disciples and assumed the succession. He had traveled about as a copyist, lumber merchant, and pharmacist, went to Hungary to study the Talmud, and also made repeated business trips to Danzig. Wherever he went, he kept his eyes open and experienced life sympathetically and freely. "I know all about sinners," he once said, "and so I also know how to straighten a young tree that is growing warped." When Bunam first grew aware of the Hasidic truth, he studied with the Maggid of Koznitz, whom he frequently visited. Later he journeyed to Lublin, where the seer immediately became fond of this worldly man. Finally, he made the acquaintance of the Yehudi and was soon his most trusted disciple. After the Yehudi's death, the great majority of the Hasidim of Psisha chose Bunam for their rabbi, but he was very reluctant to follow the call, and let many who came to see him wait for days, because he found it so difficult to practice his new vocation. He had no contact with the masses, not even that which the Yehudi had with his followers during the last period of his life, that of accepting their enthusiasm. But once he began seriously to teach, his teaching became his most vital function, and one he discharged with a strong sense of responsibility. He shook and revolutionized the entire lives of the young men who came from everywhere and begged permission to remain near him. Since these youths were leaving their homes and business for his sake, families from far and wide expressed more enmity to him than to any other Tzaddik. Many Tzadikim of his time were hostile to him for objective reasons. Rabbi Naftali of Ropchitz, who had fought most vehemently against the Yehudi, once told a young man who had come to ask his blessing on his marriage to a girl from the neighborhood of Pisha, "I am not saying anything against the rabbi, for he is a Tzaddik, but his way is dangerous to the disciples who follow him. We serve so many years to arrive at the power and fervor they acquire in so short a time. With those methods, the other side may slip in, God forbid, with the help of the demoniacal planet Venus." Finally, at the great Tzadikim wedding at Ostila, there was something very like a court session, in which the rabbi of Apt presided and dismissed the case, which was, however, more legitimate than the accusation guessed. Bunam tried to continue to lead his Hasidim along the way the Yehudi had taken, but he could not maintain it, for he did not share his teacher's belief that man must be prepared for redemption here and now, and that redemption was really so close at hand. The Yehudi had tried to strike roots in the goal. But Bunam could no longer conceive this goal as the direct aim of his own personal actions, and so the heritage of his master was left hanging in air. The prospect of a new fusion of teaching and prayer, which had brightened the horizon for a brief moment, now vanished. It passed because the old rootedness was no more, and it had proved impossible to strike new roots. Wisdom could still prosper in the atmosphere of individualism, of abandonment, which now became the abandonment of the goal. But holiness could not ripen in it. Wise Bunam was known as the man versed in the mystery, but he was no longer close to the mystery itself, as the Yehudi, like the early Tzadikim, had been. His profound table talk and crystalline parables bear powerful witness to the religious truth, but he cannot be regarded as the body and voice of the religious spirit. Prayer, which the Yehudi had delayed, that is to say, subjectivized, was made subsidiary to teaching, a natural result of the supremacy of the school over the congregation. And under the influence of rootlessness, teaching itself ceased to be the transmission of the unutterable, and again became mere preoccupation with the study of contents. The sinister quality of this later period of disintegration, which was only glossed over by Rabbi Bunam's clear wisdom, plainly comes out in the legend about his son, Rabbi Abraham Moshe, who died before his 30th year, soon after his father. He was all awareness of death and longing for death. His father said of his son that he had the soul of King Jeroboam I, who separated Israel from Judah, that now his way could lead either to utter evil or to perfect goodness and an early death, and it led to the second. What the young rabbi says concerning the sacrifice of Isaac has a dark personal ring. Abraham's love for his son was expressed in his very readiness to sacrifice him. For Isaac dwelt in Abraham's house only as a son, while in reality he was the sacrificial lamb of God. There is a strange story that before his wedding he married one of the Yehudi's granddaughters. Rabbi Bunam sent him to the graveyard to invite one of the dead, and Moshe made a mistake and invited the wrong one. He did not remain at home after he was married, but took to the woods with a group of youths attached to him, and with them learned the Hasidic way. We know of a youth group of this kind around Rabbi Shalom Shachna, and shall find the same situation in the case of Rabbi Mendel of Vorki. It was the same wood through which the seer of Lublin had once driven, where he had said that the entire manifest and hidden teachings, together with the divine presence, would once be present there. His father came to fetch him home to his young wife. As if waking from sleep, he said, "I forgot." The story, entitled "The Secrets of Dying," tells how he was involved in the death of his father, who all his life had learned to die. He hesitated to become his father's successor, for he knew that by so doing he would cut short his own life. Yet in the end, he decided for it. Only 2 years later, however, he craved death and died. He was as beautiful in death as he had been in life. A Tzaddik who approached as he was being carried to the grave cried, "Alas for the beauty which must rot in the earth," and then lapsed into a silence, which he did not break the whole of that day. It is said that Rabbi Abraham Moshe was a great musician. As far as we know, he was Rabbi Bunam's only son. If we follow Rabbi Hanok in regarding Rabbi Bunam's disciples as commentaries on his teachings, then we must consider Rabbi Menahem Mendel of Kotzk, died in 1859, as that commentary, which was itself in need of a commentary, but he never found one, for his disciples were not such a commentary. From childhood on, Rabbi Mendel was a rebel who zealously guarded his own independent way. It is told that when the seer of Lublin sent for the youth, and according to his custom, asked him questions which revealed his own gift of seeing, Mendel answered only under protest, and later, when the seer rebuked him for his way because it led to melancholy, Mendel left Lublin and went to Psisha. There he did indeed submit to the Yehudi's guidance, but soon after his master's death, his irrepressible soul again revolted, not only in anger at the swarms of idle visitors, it was mutiny of the spirit. When he himself became a rabbi, it grew quite clear that he was fanatically intent on a fundamental renovation of the movement. Hasidism was to remember the purpose of man's creation, to lift up the heavens. He declared, "Holy revelation has deteriorated into habit, and every ounce of strength had to be concentrated to press on to revelation, to that point from which the heavens can be lifted up." This could no longer be the task of the congregation. It was the task of the disciples. The bond between congregation and school seems to be definitely severed. The congregation still had prayer, and prayer had as superior a significance at Kotzk as anywhere else. The rabbi himself was praised for having prayed without effort or ostentation, like one conversing with his friend. But in order to deceive the world, and at Kotzk, they were always intent on dissembling in the sight of the world. Prayers were quickly gotten over with. Indeed, there was no longer any real feeling for congregational prayer as such. Prayer and teaching had finally become two worlds which were related only through knowledge of the goal, but not through the warmth of the heart and enthusiasm of practice. The temple of love, where the great love between the Hasidim once lived, was closed because of the abuse of the holy fire and could not be opened again. Everything depended on the discipleship as an elite, which was to press forward to revelation. Toward the end of his life, Rabbi Mendel hinted at what he had originally had in mind, saying that he had intended going into the woods with 400 Hasidim and giving them manna so that they might know the kingly power of God. This is the vision of a new wandering through the desert to receive the new revelation. Rabbi Mendel interpreted the words in the Talmud that the Torah was given only to those who eat manna, as referring only to those who had no care for the morrow exod. 1619 ff. In this connection, it is significant that even as a child, he insisted that he remembered standing at Sinai, and as a rabbi, he enjoined everyone to imagine the stand at Sinai in his heart. Certain of his utterances, which have been transmitted, indicate his hope that every member of his selected group would be able to see straight into heaven and become like the Baal Shem. This was quite consistent, for he regarded himself as the Sabbath on which the work of the great week, begun with the Baal Shem, reached its culmination. But these visions soon faded. The overwhelming disappointments he had suffered in his early years led him to concentrate on learning with fanatic intensity. His disciples, most of whom, incidentally, had to gain their livelihood by manual labor, thought themselves far above the rest of the world, and this led to undesirable developments. After his first bold hopes had been wrecked, his only concern was to maintain, internally and externally, what he considered the truth, which was not a content, but a personal quality, something which cannot be imitated. He expounded the words in the psalm that God is close to all who call on him in truth, by interpreting it to mean, who call on him by the quality of truth dwelling in their soul, and he refused to make peace even with the school of a friend. If it had to be on terms that violated this quality, he was even more uncompromising in his defense of inner truth. God's commandment, He taught, must not be made an idol to hide the truth. And when we say God, we must mean the true God and not a molten image of our fantasy. It is quite understandable that only a few of his disciples and former companions, such as the Rabbi of Ger, who saw in Mendel a spark of the true fire and lay down under it, incorporated the stern teaching of personal truth in their lives and made it live. One disciple later defined this teaching to mean, there is no truth until one's entire person is internally one and unified in his service. Until one's entire person is one truth, from the first to the last of the letters of the scriptures. Most of them probably enjoyed listening to Rabbi Mendel's utterances, such as his praise of Pharaoh, because he was a man and had remained steadfast in the face of the plagues. But they did not realize the implications of his utterances. His disappointment in his Hasidim certainly did much to make him somber and aloof for the last 20 years of his life. But it would be taking this tragic figure of Hasidic agony too lightly if we were to explain the events of his life in terms of his personal experiences, without analyzing the change in faith itself. It seems to me that the decline of a great movement, above all of a great religious movement, is the most severe test to which the faith of a really believing man can be put, a far more difficult test than any personal fate. And Rabbi Mendel was a really believing man. He once said to himself, "I have faith. Faith is clearer than vision." End quote. To me, the most important of all questionings of fate is how such closeness to God could change into such remoteness from God. In the history of Hasidism, this question appears in the school of Psisha. The Yehudi's words, "This too will be corrupted," are evidence that he had already sensed it. He tried to combat it by powerfully calling for a turning. This question also threw its shadow over Rabbi Bunam, as we know, among other things, from his radical elaboration of the theme of Satan's Hasidim, and he answered it by teaching that the shepherd is there, even when the sheep do not see him. In Rabbi Mendel's time, the decline had advanced so far, and he was so sensitive to it, that the question felled him with cruel force, and he succumbed to its blows. The crisis came on a Friday evening, on which the rabbi did not pronounce the benediction of sanctification until midnight, and did not leave his room to come to the Sabbath table until that time. The oral reports, almost all of which have been preserved, differ considerably on what happened then, but all agree on a certain more or less outspoken antinomian note on the transference of Rabbi Mendel's inner rebelliousness to his relation to the Torah. This holds even though we do not know whether he really said the words attributed to him by the so-called enlightened group. That man with all his urges and lusts is part of God, and whether he finally cried out, "There is no judgment, and there is no judge," or whether he only touched the candlestick and thus ostentatiously sinned against the law of the Sabbath. At all events, something profoundly shocking must have occurred, for otherwise we could not explain one incident on which all the reports are fairly agreed. It is that Rabbi Mordecai Joseph, once Rabbi Mendel's fellow student at Rabbi Bunam's, later his disciple, and always his secret rival, called to the Hasidim. The tablets and the broken tablets were both preserved in the Ark of the Covenant, but when God's name is desecrated, there is no place for consideration of a rabbi's honor. Tie him up. Rabbi Mendel's brother-in-law, the faithful Rabbi of Ger, opposed Rabbi Joseph and succeeded in quieting a large number of Hasidim. The rest left Kotzk after the Sabbath, Rabbi Mordecai Joseph at their head. He settled in the town of Izbika and later declared that heaven had commanded him to leave his former teacher. From that time on, throughout the remaining 20 years of his life, Rabbi Mendel kept to his room behind two doors, which were almost always closed. 2 holes were bored through one door, through which he heard the service in the adjoining house of prayer, sometimes probably watching. The other door he occasionally opened himself, when Hasidim were gathered outside. On such occasions he stood on the threshold without his kaftan. His face was awful to behold. He cursed them in choppy words that burst from his lips with such force that they were seized with terror and fled from the house through doors and windows. But sometimes, On a Friday evening, he issued from his room, dressed in his white pekashe, and greeted his visitors, whom he otherwise gave only the tips of his fingers through the hole in the door. But he never sat down at the Sabbath table and almost never ate more than a plate of soup in the evening. When called to read the Torah on a Sabbath, he would go to the pulpit, his prayer shawl drawn over his face, and would go back again as soon as he had read the scriptural portion. Mice came and went in his room as they pleased, and when the Hasidim heard them scuttling about, they whispered to the newcomers that these were souls who had come to the rabbi for redemption. And if you were to ask a Hasid of Kotzk what the rabbi did about the bath of immersion, you would be told to this day that the legendary well of Miriam, which, locked in stone, once accompanied the Jews on their journey through the desert, had opened up in the rabbi's room. I have told the story of the Rabbi of Kotzk in such detail because it is so striking an illustration of the end of a process. It gives the impression of being the final act in a drama. But to regard it as an end from the purely chronological point of view would be a mistake. On the contrary, Kotzk became a focus for Hasidic life and work, which went on as though this were not the close of a phase, but the middle. 3 Tzadikim who were close friends of Rabbi Mendel are a good example of this. They were Yitzhak of Vorki, who died a decade before Mendel 1848, and must be considered together with his son, whose name was also Mendel, died in 1868, and Yitzhak Meir of Ger died in 1866, and Hanok of Alexander died in 1870, who both survived Rabbi Mendel of Kotzk by almost 10 years. But if we listen intently, we can hear midnight striking in the lives of these disciples too, though much more slowly. I shall take Rabbi Hanok, the last of the 3, first. Because of them all, he was a disciple of the Rabbi of Kotzk in the truest sense of the word. Rabbi Mendel and these 3 had all studied together at Rabbi Bunam's when their teacher died. The Rabbi of Ger, who was then 28 and had already attained to his own spiritual position and his own sphere of work, deliberately subordinated himself to the Rabbi of Kotzk after talking with him in the woods all through one night. So tradition has it, because he saw the light shining from Tomasho, Rabbi Mendel's first home. The Rabbi of Vorki, who was 20 years older than the other 2, visited the seer of Lublin when he was a mere boy and later studied with David of Lelov and Bunam. When Rabbi Bunam died, he attached himself to Abraham Moshe for the brief period of his rabbinate, and then headed a congregation of his own, for a time even in Bzisha. All through his life, however, he was a true friend to Rabbi Mendel. But Rabbi Hanok was the disciple par excellence of the Rabbi of Kotzk, who had once been his fellow student in Rabbi Bunam's house of study. Rabbi Hanok always said that prior to the Rabbi of Kotzk, no one had taught him that a Hasid was a human being who asked for the meaning. Even in Kotzk, he continued to hide his deep and burning nature under all sorts of foolery. He actually developed in the teachings of Rabbi Mendel only the old, the original Hasidic element. His main contribution was that he gave a more concrete and perfect form to the concept of lifting up the heavens. He taught that the so-called 2 worlds, heaven and earth, are in reality one single world, which has split apart but will grow whole again if man makes the earth entrusted to him like heaven. Here he seems to demand the opposite of lifting up the heavens. And yet it is the same thing, for a heaven which is no longer separate from earth, no longer deprived of earth, a heaven which has no gaps, must certainly have been lifted. All men, moreover, have the possibility of making the earth like heaven, for at the bottom of every heart there is a residue of the substance and the power of heaven, which can operate from its human habitation. Israel is in exile, man is in exile, but it is the exile of his own baseness, to which he lends the control of his heavenly heart. This must be taken as the point of departure for man's sharing in the redemption. Here we have the classical Hasidic teachings in a new form, approaching the views even of the era in which we are living. The parable of the Maggid's disciple, Rabbi Aaron of Karlin, about the negation of the ego, reappears in a new practical form when we hear that Rabbi Hanok never referred to himself as I, because that pronoun belongs to God alone. But melancholy, though not despairing utterances, such as his words concerning the aging of melodies, testified to his deep insight into the decline of Hasidism and its need for regeneration. In contrast, the brilliant sayings of Rabbi Yitzhak Meir of Ger cannot be worked into a unified and relatively independent doctrine like those of Rabbi Hanok. The Rabbi of Ger was an aphorist, somewhat like Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, whom he resembled in other respects as well. He too was a representative Tzaddik of far-reaching influence, but he concerned himself with and represented the social and cultural affairs of Polish Jewry to a far greater extent than the Rabbi of Rizhin, and he spoke of himself with a humble self-criticism quite foreign to Rabbi Israel. His critical and yet not hopeless attitude toward the movement, whose decline he recognized, is expressed very clearly in a certain description, surely not without reference to his own experience, which he drew in his old age, of a congregation which had everything: a leader and members and a house of study and all the appurtenances. Suddenly Satan bore out the innermost point, but everything else remained just as it was, and the wheel kept on turning, only that the innermost point was lacking. He was speaking intimately to his grandson, but suddenly the description wrested a cry from him: God help us! We must not let it happen. Rabbi Yitzhak of Vorki, the third of the three disciples of Kotzker, was also given to self-criticism, but he did not have such clear-cut resolution in the face of the declining movement. This noble man, who among all the disciples came closest to the mature wisdom of Rabbi Bunam, seems not to have realized the problems of that late hour. But I think that what he said about the seemingly hopeless and yet not hopeless turning of the great sinner goes beyond the sphere of personal experience. His son, Mendel of Vorki, on the other hand, gave direct and forceful expression to the crisis, not so much in one or the other of his sayings, as through his silence. The variations handed down to us on the theme of his silence form a curious picture. With him, silence is not a rite, as with the Quakers, nor is it ascetic practice, as with some Hindu sects. The Rabbi of Kotzker called it an art. Silence was his way. It was not based on a negative principle, nor was it merely the absence of speech. It was positive and had a positive effect. Mendel's silence was a shell filled with invisible essence, and those who were with him breathed it. There is a story of how he met another Tzaddik for the first time, how they sat opposite each other for an hour in complete silence, somewhat like Aegidius Street, Francis's disciple, and Street Louis of France, and both derived benefit from this experience. He spent a night of silence with his Hasidim, and they felt themselves uplifted toward the one. There is no doubt that silence was his special kind of fervor of Hasidism. But it was not only that. When he himself spoke of silence, though not of his own, which he never touched on directly, he did not interpret it as soundless prayer, but as soundless weeping, or as a soundless scream. The soundless scream is the reaction to a great sorrow. It is in general the Jew's reaction to his own great sorrow. It befits us. By reading between the lines, we discover that it is particularly his. Mendel of Vorki's reaction to the hour in which the present too is corrupted. The time for words is past. It has become late. Shalom Shachna of Probishch. The Hen and the Ducklings. Rabbi Shalom Shachna, the son of Abraham the angel, lost both his parents when he was very young, and grew up in the house of Rabbi Nahum of Chernobyl, who gave him his granddaughter to wife. However, some of his ways were different from Rabbi Nahum's and unpleasing to him. He seemed to be very fond of show, nor was he constant in his devotion to the teachings. The Hasidim kept urging Rabbi Nahum to force Rabbi Shalom to live more austerely. One year during the month of Elul, a time when everyone contemplates the turning to God and prepares for the day of judgment, Rabbi Shalom, instead of going to the house of study with the others, would betake himself to the woods every morning and not come home until evening. Finally, Rabbi Nahum sent for him and admonished him to learn a chapter of the Kabbalah every day. and to recite the Psalms, as did the other young people at this season. Instead, he was idling and loafing in a way particularly ill becoming to one of his descent. Rabbi Shalom listened silently and attentively. Then he said, "It once happened that a duck's eggs were put into a hen's nest, and she hatched them. The first time she went to the brook with the ducklings, they plunged into the water and swam merrily out. The hen ran along the bank in great distress, clucking to the audacious youngsters to come back immediately lest they drown. 'Don't worry about us, mother,' called the ducklings. 'We needn't be afraid of the water. We know how to swim.'" The powerful prayer. Once on the eve of the new year in the house of prayer, while Rabbi Nachman of Chernobyl was reciting the afternoon prayer with great fervor, his grandson-in-law, Rabbi Shalom, who used to recite this prayer at the reader's desk, suddenly felt a sinking of the spirit. All around him were praying with great concentration, but it needed all the strength he had just to utter one word after the other, and to grasp the simple meaning of each word. Afterward, Rabbi Nachman said to him, "My son, how your prayer took heaven by storm today. It lifted up thousands of banished souls." In peace. Once, when Rabbi Shalom Shachna happened to be staying in a small town of the district of Kiev, the old Tzaddik, Rabbi Zev of Zhitomir, arrived to spend the Sabbath there. On Thursday evening, Rabbi Shalom prepared to leave and went to bid Rabbi Zev farewell. The Tzaddik inquired when Rabbi Shalom expected to reach his destination. "Tomorrow, around 3 in the afternoon," was the reply. "Why do you plan to be on the road after the noon hour on the day before the Sabbath?" Rabbi Zev asked in surprise. "At 12 o'clock I usually put on my Sabbath clothes and start singing the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's King of Peace. By that time the Sabbath peace has already begun for me." "And what am I to do?" replied Rabbi Shalom. "If a tenant farmer comes to me toward evening and tells me his troubles, tells me that his calf has fallen sick, and from his words I gather that he is saying to me, 'You are a lofty soul, and I am a lowly soul. Lift me up to you.' What am I to do then?" From off the table the old man took the 2 candlesticks with the lighted candles, and grasping them in his 2 hands, he accompanied his young guest through the long corridor to the outer door. "Go in peace," he said. "Go in peace." The streets of Nehardia. Rabbi Shalom said, "The Talmud tells of a wise man versed in the lore of the stars, and relates that the paths of the firmament were as bright and clear to him as the streets in the town of Nehardia where he lived. Now if only we could say about ourselves that the streets of our city are as clear and bright to us as the paths of the firmament. For to let the hidden life of God shine out in this lowest world, the world of bodiliness, that is the greater feat of the two." With the same passion, it is written, a Psalm of David and following, after he had gone in to Bathsheba. This is how Rabbi Shalom expounded the verse. David returned to God and said his psalm to him with the same passion with which he had gone to Bathsheba. That was why God forgave him on the instant. On the highest rung. A Hasid of Rabbi Shalom, living in a certain town, happened to be present when the Rav, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, on a visit to the town in the course of a journey on the Sabbath, said Torah with great fervor. But suddenly it seemed to the Hasid that the Rav grew less fervent, that what he said now appeared to lack the admirable passion of what had gone before. The next time the Hasid was with his teacher Rabbi Shalom, he told of the incident and openly stated his surprise. "How can you venture to judge such matters?" said the Tzaddik. "You don't know enough to do that. But I shall tell you, there is a very high and holy rung, and he who reaches it is freed of all the stuff of earth, and can no longer kindle to flame." Israel of Risen. The New Heaven. When the Rabbi of Risen was a child, he was once walking up and down in the yard on a Friday toward evening time, when the Hasidim had already gone off to pray. A Hasid went up to him and said, "Why don't you go in? The Sabbath has already begun." "The Sabbath hasn't begun yet," he replied. "How do you know that?" asked the Hasid. On the Sabbath, he answered, there always appears a new heaven, and I can't see any sign of it yet. On earth, Rabbi Israel of Rizhin, the son of Rabbi Shalom Shachna, and Rabbi Moshe of Savran had quarreled. The Rabbi of Savran, prompted by the wish to make peace, paid his adversary a visit. Rabbi Israel asked him, do you believe there is a Tzaddik who clings to God unceasingly? The other answered as one who wants to hide a doubt, there might well be, to which the Rabbi of Rizhin replied, my grandfather was like that. My grandfather, Rabbi Abraham, whom they called the angel. Then the other said, he did not, come to think of it, spend many days on this earth. And the Rabbi of Rizhin, and my father Rabbi Shalom was like that. And again the Rabbi of Savran remarked, he too, come to think of it, did not spend many days on this earth. Then the Rabbi of Rizhin replied, why speak of years and days? Do you think they were on earth in order to dry up here? They came, accomplished their service, and returned. The tale about smoke. Once Rabbi Moshe of Kobrin came to visit the Rabbi of Rizhin on the eve of the Sabbath. He found his host standing in the middle of the room, his pipe in his hand and clouds of smoke wreathing round him. The Rabbi of Rizhin immediately began to tell a story. There was once a man who lost his way in the woods at twilight on the eve of the Sabbath. Suddenly, he saw a house in the distance. He walked toward it. When he entered, he found himself face to face with a robber, a fierce-looking robber, and on the table in front of him lay a gun. The robber jumped up, but before he could get hold of the gun, the man had seized it, and quick as lightning he thought, if I hit him, it will be well. If I miss, the room will at least be full of smoke, and I can escape. When the Rabbi of Rizhin reached this point in his story, he put down his pipe and said, Sabbath. Two kinds of Tzadikim. The Rabbi of Rizhin told how the people of Jassy sneered at the Rabbi of Apt after his sermons. He added, in every generation there are people who grumble about the Tzaddik and look askance at Moses. For the Rabbi of Apt is the Moses of his generation. He paused, and after a while he continued, there are two kinds of service and two kinds of Tzadikim. One sort serves God with learning and prayer, the other with eating and drinking and earthly delights, raising all this to holiness. This is the kind the grumbling is about. But God has made them as they are, because he does not want man to be caged in his lusts, but to be free in them. That is the calling of these Tzadikim, to make men free. Those others are the lords of the manifest. These are the lords of the hidden world. It is to them that secrets are revealed, and the meaning of dreams unfolded, as it was to Joseph, who curled his beautiful hair and served God with the delights of this world. On another occasion he spoke about the verse, the heavens are the heavens of the Lord, but the earth hath he given to the children of men, saying, there are two kinds of Tzadikim. Those of the one sort learn and pray the livelong day, and hold themselves far from lowly matters, in order to attain to holiness, while the others do not think of themselves, but only of delivering the holy sparks which are buried in all things back to God, and they make all lowly things their concern. The former, who are always busy preparing for heaven, the verse calls the heavens, and they have set themselves apart for the Lord. But the others are the earth given to the children of men. Sig 9. Tzadikim and Hasidim. The Rabbi of Rizhin said, just as the holy letters of the alphabet are voiceless without the vowel signs, and the vowel signs cannot stand without the letters, so Tzadikim and Hasidim are bound up with one another. The Tzadikim are the letters, and the Hasidim who journey to them are the vowel signs. The Hasidim need the Tzadik, but he has just as much need of them. Through them, he can be uplifted. Because of them, he can sink, God forbid. They carry his voice. They sow his work in the world. Suppose that one of the Hasidim who come to me is on the road and meets a carriage full of so-called enlightened passengers. He persuades the coachman to let him ride beside him, and when the time comes to say the afternoon prayer, he gets down from his seat and makes ready, and prays while the carriage waits. And the passengers are annoyed and revile the coachman and shout at him. In the midst of all this, perhaps through all this, they experience a change of soul. The roof. Jacob Ornstein, the Rav of Luau, opposed the Hasidic way, and so once when the Rabbi of Lizhensk was calling on him, he thought his visitor would launch into subtle interpretations of the scriptures in order to impress him with the scholarship of the Hasidim. But the Tzadik only asked, "What are the roofs of the houses in Lao made of?" "Out of sheet iron," said the Rav. "And why out of sheet iron?" "To be protected against fire." "Then they might just as well be made of brick," said Rabbi Israel, and took his leave. When he was gone, the Rav laughed and exclaimed, "And that is the man people flock to." A few days later, Rabbi Meir of Primishlan came to Luau to see the Rabbi of Lizhensk, who was his friend, but found he had already left. They told him what he had said. His face lit up and he said, "Truly, the roof, the heart of the man who watches over the congregation, should be of brick, so shaken with all their sorrows that it threatens to break every moment, and yet endures. But instead, it is of sheet iron." The other way. Once, when the Jews were passing through a period of great stress, the Rabbi of Abt, who was then the eldest of his generation, issued a command for a universal fast in order to call down God's mercy. But Rabbi Israel summoned his musicians, whom he carefully selected from a number of different towns, and night after night he had them play their most beautiful melodies on the balcony of his house. Whenever the sound of the clarinet and the delicate tinkle of the little bells floated down from above, the Hasidim began to gather in the garden until there was a whole crowd of them. The music would soon triumph over their dejection, and they would dance, stamping their feet and clapping their hands. People who were indignant at these doings reported to the Rabbi of Abt that the day of fasting he had ordered had been turned into a day of rejoicing. He answered, "It is not up to me to call him to account, who has kept the memory of the command in the scriptures green in his heart. And when ye go to war in your land against the adversary that oppresseth you, then ye shall sound an alarm with the trumpets, and ye shall be remembered before the Lord your God." The counter-ruse. Several mitnagdim of Sanok came to the Rabbi of Lizhensk when he was passing through their city, and complained to him, "In our congregation we pray at dawn, and after that we sit wrapped in our prayer shawls, with our phylacteries on head and arm, and learn a chapter of the Mishnah. Not so the Hasidim. They pray after the hour set for prayer has passed, and when they have finished praying they sit down together and drink schnapps, and yet they are called the devout, and we the adversaries." Leib, the Rabbi of Lizhensk's servant, was seized with an irresistible desire to laugh. As he listened to this complaint, and not troubling to conceal the reason for his laughter, he said, "The service and prayer of the mitnagdim are ice cold and have no warmth at all, just like a corpse, and when you watch by the side of a body, you study the chapter from the Mishnah prescribed for this occasion. But when the Hasidim have done their bit of service, their heart glows and is warm like one who is alive, and whoever is alive must drink schnapps." The Rabbi said, "We'll let the jest pass, but the truth of the matter is this. You know that ever since the day our temple was destroyed, we pray instead of making sacrifice. And just as the sacrifice was disqualified if the thought was impure, so it is with prayer. That is why the evil urge devises ruse upon ruse to confuse him who prays with thoughts alien to prayer. Now for this the Hasidim have invented a counter-ruse. After praying, they sit down together and drink to one another. To life, each tells what is burdening his heart, and then they say to one another, 'May God grant your desire.' And since so our sages say prayers can be said in any language whatsoever, this speaking and answering of theirs while drinking is also regarded as prayer. But all the evil urge sees is that they are eating and drinking and using everyday speech, and so he stops bothering his head about them in it. The Hasidim were once sitting together and drinking when the rabbi entered the room. It seemed to them that he did not eye them with favor. "Are you displeased to find us drinking, Rabbi?" they asked. Yet it is said that when Hasidim sit together over their cups, it is just as though they were studying the Torah. "There is many a word in the Torah," said the Rabbi of Lizhensk, "which is holy in one passage and unholy in another. So for instance it is written, 'And the Lord said to Moses, Hew thee 2 tables of stone, but also, thou shalt not make unto thee a hewn image.' Why is it that the same word is holy in the first passage and unholy in the second? It is because there the word thee comes after, and here it precedes. So it is with all we do. Whenever the thee comes after, all is holy. When it precedes, all is unholy." The judgment of the Messiah. Many heads of families of Berdichev complained to the Rabbi of Lizhensk that their sons-in-law had left wives and children in order to become his disciples, and when they asked him to persuade the youths to return home, he told them about a young man who had lived in the days of the great Maggid. He had quitted his father-in-law's house to go to the Maggid. They had fetched him back, and he had pledged on a handclasp that he would stay at home. Yet shortly thereafter he was gone. Now his father-in-law got the Rav of the town to declare that this broken promise was cause for divorce. The young man was thus deprived of all means of subsistence. Soon he fell ill and died. When the Tzaddik had finished his story, he added, "And now, my good men, when the Messiah comes, the young man will hail his father-in-law before his court of justice. The father-in-law will quote the Rav of the town, and the Rav will quote a passage from the commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Then the Messiah will ask the young man why, after giving his hand on it that he would remain at home, he broke his promise just the same. And the young man will say, 'I just had to go to the rabbi.' In the end, the Messiah will pronounce judgment. To the father-in-law he will say, 'You took the Rav's word as your authority, and so you are justified.' And to the Rav he will say, 'You took the law as your authority, and so you are justified.' And then he will add, 'But I have come for those who are not justified.'" The Tzaddik and the people. The Rabbi of Lizhensk said, "As when someone prepares to split a tree with an axe and takes a great swing at it but misses, and the axe goes into the earth, so it is when the Tzaddik talks to people in order to rouse their hearts to the service of God. But they do not heed him and admire only the cleverness and artfulness of his sermon." The hidden teachings. Concerning the verse, "For instruction shall go forth from me," the Rabbi of Lizhensk said, "The teachings will never be altered. The first book of Moses will forever be the book of beginnings, which tells what happened to our fathers from the day God created the world. But there is something which is hidden from us, what God wrought before he created the world. And that is what is meant by the words, 'Now will it be said to Jacob and of Israel, what God hath wrought.' And the same is meant by the words, 'For instruction shall go forth from me, telling what I wrought before I created the world." End quote. Ezekiel and Aristotle. Once when many wise men were gathered about his board, the Rabbi of Lizhensk asked, "Why are the people so set against our master Moses ben Maimon?" A rabbi answered, "Because in a certain passage he asserts that Aristotle knew more about the spheres of heaven than Ezekiel. So why should we not be set against him?" The Rabbi of Lizhensk said, "It is just as our master Moses ben Maimon says. 2 people entered the palace of a king. One took a long time over each room, examined the gorgeous stuffs and treasures with the eyes of an expert, and could not see enough. The other walked through the halls and knew nothing but this. This is the king's house. This is the king's robe. A few steps more, and I shall behold my lord, the king." The road makers. When the Rabbi of Ger visited the Rabbi of Lizhensk in Sadagora, his host asked, "Are there good roads in Poland?" "Yes," he replied. "And who," the Rabbi of Lizhensk continued, "is responsible for the work and directs it, Jews or non-Jews?" "Jews," answered the Rabbi of Ger. "Who else," exclaimed the Rabbi of Lizhensk, "could be versed in the work of making roads?" Who may be called man? Concerning the words in the Scriptures, when any man of you bringeth an offering to the Lord, the Rabbi of Lizhensk said, only he who brings himself to the Lord as an offering may be called man. The right kind of altar. It is written, an altar of earth thou shalt make unto me, and if thou make me an altar of stone, thou shalt not build it of hewn stones. For if thou lift up thy tool upon it, thou hast profaned it. It's climax where the Rabbi of Lizhensk expounded this as follows. The altar of earth is the altar of silence, which is most pleasing to God. But if you do make an altar of words, do not hew and chisel them, for such artifice would profane it. The nature of service. The Rabbi of Lizhensk said, this is the service man must perform all of his days, to shape matter into form, to refine the flesh, and to let the light penetrate the darkness until the darkness itself shines, and there is no longer any division between the two. As it is written, and there was evening and there was morning one day. And another time he said, one should not make a great to-do about serving God. Does the hand boast when it carries out the will of the heart? Walking the tight rope. Once the Hasidim were seated together in all brotherliness, when Rabbi Israel joined them, his pipe in his hand. Because he was so friendly, they asked him, tell us, dear Rabbi, how should we serve God? He was surprised at the question and replied, how should I know? But then he went right on talking and told them this story. There were two friends, and both were accused before the king of a crime. Since he loved them, he wanted to show them mercy. He could not acquit them because even the king's word cannot prevail over a law. So he gave this verdict. A rope was to be stretched across a deep chasm, and the two accused were to walk it, one after the other. Whoever reached the other side was to be granted his life. It was done as the king ordered, and the first of the friends got safely across. The other, still standing in the same spot, cried to him, tell me, my friend, how did you manage to cross that terrible chasm? The first called back, I don't know anything but this. Whenever I felt myself toppling over to one side, I leaned to the other. End quote. Breaking impulses. A young man gave a note of request to the Rabbi of Lizhensk. He had written to ask God's help in breaking his evil impulse. The Rabbi's eyes laughed as he looked at him. You want to break impulses? You will break your back and your hip, yet you will not break an impulse. But if you pray and learn and work in all seriousness, the evil in your impulses will vanish of itself. Suffering. A man who was afflicted with a terrible disease complained to Rabbi Israel that his suffering interfered with his learning and praying. The rabbi put his hand on his shoulder and said, how do you know, friend, what is more pleasing to God, your studying or your suffering? God the Forgiver. The time the Rabbi of Lizhensk followed the advice of his physicians and went to Odessa to bathe in the sea, a grandson of the famous Rabbi Jacob Emden was living there. His name was Meir, and he had strayed from the path of his fathers. When Rabbi Israel heard about him, he sent for him and invited him to come to Lizhensk. He promised that all his expenses would be taken care of. Meir agreed. He had sat at the rabbi's table in Lizhensk only a short time when he made complete penance. One day, however, the Tzadik noticed that he was looking depressed and asked, Meir, my son, what is troubling you? If it is your sins, remember that the turning makes up for everything. Meir answered, why should I not be troubled? After doing penance, I keep returning to sin over and over again as a dog returns to his vomit, and how can I know whether my penance is still accepted? The Rabbi of Lizhensk touched his arm and said, have you never wondered why we read in the prayer, for thou art a forgiver of Israel, and a pardoner of the tribes of Jeshurun? Would it not be enough to write, you forgive and pardon? But just as it is man's way and compulsion to sin and sin again and again, so it is God's way and his divine compulsion to forgive and pardon again and again. Penance. A confirmed sinner who allowed no evil desire to pass him by came to Rabbi Motel of Chernobyl. handed him a slip on which he had listed the sins he had committed in his life, and asked to have a penance imposed on him. When Rabbi Motel had read the slip of paper, he said, "I am too old to assume the burden of someone who requires such heavy penance. Go to the Rabbi of Lizhensk. He is young. He will take it upon himself." So the man went to the Rabbi of Lizhensk and gave him the list. And now the Rabbi of Lizhensk read the whole long column, the big items and the small, and the sinner waited. Finally the Tzaddik said, "This shall be your penance. No matter what word of prayer you utter, from now until you die, you shall not utter a single word of prayer with empty lips, but you shall preserve the fullness of every word." God and gladness. Concerning the words in the Scriptures, "And it shall be, if thou shalt forget the Lord thy God," the Rabbi of Lizhensk said, "It is well known that by every 'and it shall be' in the Scriptures, gladness is meant. Here too, this is what is meant. Here we are told, if you forget gladness and fall into a depression, you are forgetting the Lord your God. For it is written, strength and gladness are in his place." The child thinks of his father. The Rabbi of Lizhensk said, "In certain prayer books we do not read, 'Cause us, O Lord our God, to lie down,' but 'Cause us, our Father, to lie down.' For when man thinks of God as God, whose glory fills the world and there is no thing in which God is not, then he is ashamed to lie down on a bed in his sight. But if he thinks of God as his Father, then he feels like a fond child whose father sees after him when he goes to bed, and tucks him in, and watches over his sleep. As we pray, spread over us the covering of thy peace." Afar off. This question was put to the Rabbi of Lizhensk. Of the children of Israel standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, it is written, "And the people saw it and stirred, and stood afar off. How shall we interpret this? Is not the entire earth filled with the glory of God? How can one stand afar off from him?" He expounded, "Miracles are for those who have little faith." When Israel saw that God was performing miracles, they knew that they had still to stand afar off. Their hearts stirred, and in spirit they stood afar off at a place which was still befitting to them. But at the same time, they yearned for perfect faith with all the strength of their stirring hearts. To walk with one's own light. A young rabbi complained to the Rabbi of Lizhensk, "During the hours when I devote myself to my studies, I feel life and light. But the moment I stop studying, it is all gone. What shall I do?" The Rabbi of Lizhensk replied, "That is just as when a man walks through the woods on a dark night, and for a time another joins him, lantern in hand, but at the crossroads they part and the first must grope his way on alone. But if a man carries his own light with him, he need not be afraid of any darkness." End quote. Holy Spirit. The Rabbi of Lizhensk was asked, "What does it mean when they say of some person or other that he has a Holy Spirit?" He answered, "If a man really has spirit, and he does not allow it to grow impure, that is called Holy Spirit." Controversy for the sake of heaven. The Rabbi of Lizhensk said, when the Hasidim see one rabbi carrying on a controversy with another, they too begin to argue with one another. But in reality, only the Tzadikim are permitted to carry on a controversy, for it is a controversy for the sake of heaven. That is why it says in the Talmud, which controversy was for the sake of heaven? That of Hillel and Shammai. It does not say of the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel, for a controversy for the sake of heaven can be waged only by the teachers, not by their disciples. The time for prayer. Once, when Rabbi Israel was visiting the Rabbi of Apt, he waited a long time before saying the morning prayer, something he did quite frequently. When they asked him when he was going to pray, he said he did not know just yet, and told this story. A king had set an hour at which every one of his subjects was to have a free hearing. One day, a beggar came to the palace at another hour and asked to be taken to the king. The guards snapped at him and demanded whether he was not acquainted with the ruling. The beggar said, "I know all about it, but it only holds for those who want to talk to the king about the things they have need of. But I want to talk to the king about what the realm has need of." The beggar was instantly admitted. And so the rabbi of Lizhensk ended his story. How am I to know when I shall pray? A dish of beans. A number of young men came to Lizhensk from a distant town in order to spend the days of awe near Rabbi Israel. When they noticed that he did not keep the prescribed hours for prayer but waited until he was seized with fervor, they wanted to imitate him and also waited, though they did not quite know what for. After the feast of the rejoicing in the law, they went to the rabbi to take leave of him. He gave them his blessing and said, "See to it that you do not delay your prayers, but say each at its proper time. I shall tell you the story of the man whose wife served him a dish of beans for dinner, year in, year out, day after day. Once she was delayed, and the meal was put on the table an hour late. When her husband saw the beans, he grew angry and cried, 'I thought that today you were going to serve me an especially fine dish, and that the cooking of it had taken up so much time, because it required many ingredients and particular care. But I am not in the mood to wait for the beans I eat every day.' With that, the Tzaddik ended his tale. The young men bowed and started on their homeward journey. In an inn, where they stopped on the way, they met an old man whose face was unfamiliar to them, but with whom they immediately entered into conversation. When they told him what the rabbi had said to them in parting, he smiled and said, the cause of the man's anger was that there was as yet no perfect love between him and his wife. If there is such love, the man is well pleased if his wife lets him wait a long time, and then serves him a dish he eats every day, and there is nothing his heart does not regard as new and good, is one. These words struck the young men deeply. When they went to Lizhensk again on the days of awe, they told the rabbi of the incident. He was silent for a time, and then said, "What the old man said to you, he also said to me, and he also said it to God." In the attic. This story is told. Every night the rabbi of Lizhensk was in the habit of climbing to the attic and staying there for 2 hours. During that time, his servant Shmulik, who accompanied him, waited sitting on the stairs. Once the Tzaddik's daughter wanted to fetch something from a cupboard which was in the attic and found Shmulik sitting there and weeping. She asked him what was the matter. "Someone," he said, "slipped me a lot of money so that I should let him go into the rabbi, and now he is inside." He opened his hand and showed her the money. Just then the rabbi came out at the door. There was no one in the room. In Shmulik's palm lay a few shards of clay. Of a hidden Tzaddik. This story is told. A Hasid of the rabbi of Lizhensk had a daughter who was afflicted with serious eye trouble, which no doctor knew how to cure. Time and again he begged the rabbi to help him, but no help was granted him. Finally, when the girl was stricken blind, the Tzaddik said to him unasked, "Take your daughter to Luau, and when you get there, wait for the vendors who go about the streets and call out their wares, each with his own sing-song cry. For instance, fine pretzels, fresh pretzels. He whose cry you like best is the one who can heal your daughter." The Hasid did as he was told and soon discovered the man who sang out his wares most to his liking. He bought a pretzel from him and asked him to bring some to the inn the next day. When the vendor entered his room, the Hasid locked the door and repeated the words of the rabbi of Lizhensk. The vendor's eyes snapped, and he shouted, "You let me out of here, or I'll make a heap of bones of you, along with your rabbi." The Hasid opened the door in terror. The man disappeared, but the girl was cured. Return, O Israel. This is what Rabbi Israel of Lizhensk said on the Sabbath of the turning. Hosea says, "Return, O Israel, unto the Lord thy God." That was said to the whole world and to all the creatures of heaven and earth. For everything that has been created, below and above, all the servants of the Most High, the angels, the seraphim, the heavenly creatures, the holy wheels, all up to the throne of God himself, must accomplish the turning. And that is what the words, "unto the Lord thy God," mean. All creatures of all rungs to the very highest, up to the throne of God, must accomplish the turning. But when he had said this, Rabbi Israel addressed himself, O Israel, return, Israel, unto the Lord thy God. Turning and redemption. The Rabbi of Lizhensk said, they say that the Tzaddik of Spola, the grandfather, once called out, Messiah, why don't you come? What are you waiting for? I swear to you by my beard that the Jews will not atone, and I shall not contradict the grandfather of Spola. But this I promise you, Lord of the world, I promise you that they will atone just as soon as Messiah, the King, appears. And they have some justification, for before ever we sinned, you in your covenant with Abraham, between the section of the sacrifice, sentenced us to 4 exiles. Therefore, you must redeem us before we do penance. If now shand. On another occasion, the Rabbi of Lizhensk laid the fingers of his right hand on the table after the morning meal, and said, God says to Israel, return unto me, and I will return unto you. Then he turned his right hand palm up and said, But we, children of Israel, reply, Turn thou us unto thee, O Lord, and we shall be turned. Renew our days as of old, for our exile is heavy on us, and we have not the strength to return to you of ourselves. And then he turned his hand palm down again and said, But the Holy One, blessed be he, says, First you must return unto me. 4 times the Rabbi of Lizhensk turned his hand, palm up and palm down. But in the end he said, The children of Israel are right though, because it is true that the waves of anguish close over them, and they cannot govern their hearts and turn to God. The time to come. It was on a Sabbath, and the Rabbi of Lizhensk sat at his table, surrounded by his Hasidim. Then he said to them, The days are near when all will be well with the common man, both in body and in soul. But all will not be well with the extraordinary man, not in body and not in soul. And he will not even be able to recite 1 psalm. And he concluded, Why do I tell you this? So that your hearts shall not grieve. It ought to be so. It must be so. Another time he said, In the last 3 hours before redemption, it will be as difficult to cling to Jewishness as to climb a smooth wall of ice. That is why in the Hoshanot prayer we say, 3 hours, pray help. Those are the last hours. Labor pains. The Rabbi of Lizhensk said, If a pregnant woman goes into labor in the 8th month, when her time is not yet come, they try to stop her labor. But not so in the 9th month. If the woman goes into labor, then they try to hasten it, so that she may soon give birth. That is why formerly when people called to heaven begging God to free the earth of some misery, their prayer was granted, for the time was not yet come. But now that redemption is near, no prayer which ascends in behalf of the sorrowful world is of avail. But sorrow is heaped upon sorrow, so that the birth may soon be accomplished. Blowing the ram's horn on the Sabbath. On a New Year's Day which fell on a Sabbath, the Rabbi of Lizhensk said, On a New Year's Day which falls on the Sabbath, the ram's horn which summons the world to the new year must not be blown. On that day God himself blows the ram's horn, and he certainly knows how to blow. That is why on this day our hope is so wide awake. The source of mercy itself has wakened it. The 2 caps. Rabbi David Moshe, the son of the Rabbi of Lizhensk, once said to a Hasid, You knew my father when he lived in Sadagora and was already wearing the black cap and going his way in dejection. But you did not see him when he lived in Lizhensk and was still wearing his golden cap. The Hasid was astonished. How is it possible that the holy man from Lizhensk ever went his way in dejection? Did not I myself hear him say that dejection is the lowest condition? And after he had reached the summit, Rabbi David replied, He had to descend to that condition time and again in order to redeem the souls which had sunk down to it. The sound of the ram's horn. Rabbi David Moshe told this story. The year he died, my father could no longer go to the house of prayer on New Year's Day. I prayed with him in his room. His service was more wonderful than ever before. When he had ended, he said to me, Today I heard the Messiah blow the ram's horn. The meal at the close of the Sabbath. In his old age, the Rabbi of Lizhensk spent his summers in the little town of Potok. Once Rabbi Moshe of Kobrin visited him over the Sabbath. That day, the Rabbi of Lizhensk did not eat the meal at the close of the Sabbath, but sat in his garden in the evening, and the Rabbi of Kobrin kept him company. For a long time, the Rabbi of Lizhensk was silent. Then he said, "We could eat the fruits of this tree in place of the meal, couldn't we?" Then he touched the Rabbi of Kobrin's belt and said, "Let's take a little walk." And as they walked, he repeated what he had said before. "Dear Rabbi Moshe, you are a learned man. Is it not true that we are permitted to replace the meal at the close of the Sabbath with fruits?" Then the Rabbi of Kobrin understood that the Rabbi of Lizhensk was speaking of his own end and of his sons, and cried out, "Our holy Rabbi, the world still has need of you." But a month and a half after this Sabbath, Rabbi Israel died. Abraham Yaakov of Sadagora. Creatures. On the 15th day of the month, Shavat, the new year of the trees, when they were placing fruit on the table, as is the custom on this day, Rabbi Abraham Yaakov, the eldest son of the Rabbi of Lizhensk, said, "It is written, when any man of you bringeth an offering unto the Lord, ye shall bring your offering of the cattle, even of the herd or of the flock. All creatures and plants and animals bring and offer themselves to man, but through man they are all brought and offered to God. When man purifies and sanctifies himself in all his members as an offering to God, he purifies and sanctifies all the creatures." Of modern inventions. You can learn something from everything. The Rabbi of Sadagora once said to his Hasidim, "Everything can teach us something, and not only everything God has created, what man has made has also something to teach us." "What can we learn from a train?" one Hasid asked dubiously. "That because of 1 second, one can miss everything. And from the telegraph? That every word is counted and charged. And the telephone? That what we say here is heard there." Bird Song. On the Sabbath of Song, when the song from the Torah is read, which Moses and Israel sang at the Red Sea, the Rabbi of Sadagora was asked, "Why is it customary to scatter buckwheat grits for the birds on this day?" "A king," he replied, "had a little pavilion where he could be quite alone. It was built well away from all his palaces. Nobody was allowed to enter it but himself, nor could any of his servants set foot in it. Only a songbird shared the room with him, and the king listened to his song, which was dearer to him than all the music of his singers. In the hour when the waters of the Red Sea were divided, all the angels and seraphim sang praise to the Lord, but he was listening to the song of his little bird, Israel. That is why we feed the birds on this day." On the Sabbath of Song. On the Sabbath of Song, when the song sung beside the Red Sea was read, the Rabbi of Sadagora said, "It is not written that they sang the song immediately after they crossed the sea. First they had to reach the rung of perfect faith, as it is written, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Only after that come the words, then sang Moses and the children of Israel. Only he who believes can sing the song." All the melodies. Rabbi Abraham Yaakov said, "Every people has its own melody, and none sings that of another, but Israel sings all of them, in order to bring them to God." Thus, in the section of songs, all the creatures that live on the earth, and all the birds utter each his own song, but Israel makes a song out of all of their songs, in order to bring them to God. Testimony. One Friday evening, a group of so-called enlightened men entered the house of the Rabbi of Sadagora, uninvited, to hear him say the Kiddush and then to make fun of it. When the Tzaddik noticed this, he said, "The words from Genesis, which we say to inaugurate the Sabbath, and the heaven and the earth were finished, are spoken here, as we all know, in testimony of the work of creation of the one and only God. And where could testimony be more in place than where there is denial? So let us testify in the face of these who deny that God created the world and that he guides it. He rose and said the Kiddush. Everyone has his place. Rabbi Abraham was asked, "Our sages say, and there is not a thing that has not its place, and so man too has his own place. Then why do people sometimes feel so crowded?" He replied, "Because each wants to occupy the place of the other." Sufferings and pangs. Once the rabbi of Sadagora sat at his midday meal and sighed and did not eat. His sister asked him what was troubling him and repeated her questions several times. At last, he answered her with a question of his own. "Have you heard the reports about the sad condition of our brothers in Russia?" "It seems to me," she answered, "that these sufferings might be the birth pangs that herald the coming of the Messiah." The Tzaddik considered this. Perhaps, he finally said. But when suffering is about to reach its peak, Israel cries out to God, saying it can bear it no longer, and God is merciful and hears them. He relieves the suffering and postpones redemption. The wandering light. A friend once asked the rabbi of Sadagora, "How can this be? A number of holy men who lived before our time alluded to a date on which redemption was to come. The era they indicated has come and gone, but redemption has not come to pass." The Tzaddik replied, "My father, may his memory be a blessing unto us," said this. In the Talmud, we read that all the calculated dates of redemption have passed. But just as the divine presence left the sanctuary and went into exile in the course of 10 journeys, so she cannot return all at once, and the light of redemption loiters between heaven and earth. At every date, it descended one rung. The light of redemption is now dwelling in the lowest heaven, which is called the curtain. That is what my father said. But I say, the light of redemption is spread about us at the level of our heads. We do not notice it because our heads are bowed beneath the burden of exile. Oh, that God might lift up our heads. Nahum of Stepaneshti. Playing checkers. On one of the days of Hanukkah, Rabbi Nahum, the son of the rabbi of Lizhensk, entered the house of study at a time when he was not expected and found his disciples playing checkers, as was the custom on those days. When they saw the Tzaddik, they were embarrassed and stopped playing. But he gave them a kindly nod and asked, "Do you know the rules of the game of checkers?" And when they did not reply for shyness, he himself gave the answer. "I shall tell you the rules of the game of checkers. The first is that one must not make 2 moves at once. The second is that one may only move forward and not backward. And the third is that when one has reached the last row, one may move to where he likes." The choice. Rabbi Nahum once said to the Hasidim gathered about him, "If we could hang all our sorrows on pegs and were allowed to choose those we liked best, every one of us would take back his own, for all the rest would seem even more difficult to bear." The pious man. In a certain city lived a man whose piety was so much talked of that the people had given him the byname of the Pious One. He fell ill, and when his family heard that several people in the town were going to Rabbi Nahum to beg his blessing, they asked them to mention the Pious One. When they got to the Tzaddik, the people agreed. Along with the slips of paper on which they had written their names, they also gave Rabbi Nahum a slip bearing the name of the sick man, and told him this was a man who was famed far and wide for the austere life he led, and went by the name of the Pious One. The rabbi commented, "I do not know what a pious man is, and I never learned anything about it from my father either. But I fancy it must have to do with a kind of cloak. The material is made of arrogance, the lining of grudges, and it is sewed with the threads of dejection." David Moshe of Chertkov. Who makes the bands of sleep to fall? The Hasidim tell this story. When Rabbi David Moshe, a son of the rabbi of Lizhensk, was 7 years old, a fire broke out in his father's house one night. The children were assembled, and David Moshe was found to be missing. His father sent a servant to fetch him. The servant found the boy lying in bed, fully awake, and asked whether he had not noticed that there was a fire. David Moshe said nothing, but gave the servant to understand through signs that he had of course noticed it, but that since he had already said the nightly prayer, beginning, "Who makes the bands of sleep to fall upon mine eyes?" he did not want to interrupt his falling asleep and was certain he would be saved. While the servant was reporting this to the father, the fire died down. The faithful servant. Rabbi Nahum of Stepaneshch once said this of his brother, Rabbi David Moshe of Chortkov. When my brother David Moshe opens the book of Psalms and begins to recite the praises, God calls down to him, "David Moshe, my son, I am putting the whole world into your hands. Now do with it just as you like." Oh, if he only gave me the world, I should know very well what to do with it. But David Moshe is so faithful a servant that when he gives the world back, it is exactly as it was when he received it. The birth of a melody. The rabbi of Chortkov once said, "Sometimes it happens that war breaks out between two kingdoms, and the war drags on for 30 years. Then out of the groans of those who fell in battle and the cries of the victors, a melody is born, so that it may be sung before the Tzaddik." In a thick cloud. Rabbi David Moshe said, God says to Moses, "Lo, I come unto thee in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with thee." There is always danger that the spirit of the Tzaddik may mount too high and lose touch with his generation. That is why God masses the dark cloud of sorrow over the Tzaddik and sets limits to his soul, and then the word which he received can get to the people again. But when sorrow descends upon the Tzaddik, he finds God even in the sorrow, as it is written, "But Moses drew near unto the thick darkness where God was." The meekness of Moses. Once Rabbi David Moshe said with tears in his eyes, "It is written that Moses was meek above all men." How are we to interpret this? He with whom God spoke face to face, and whose work was so mighty, how could he think himself less than all others? The reason is this. In those 40 days which Moses spent on the heights, his body had become pure and luminous, like that of the ministering angels. After that time, he said to himself, "Of what importance is it if I, whose body was purified, give service to God? But if one of Israel, who is still clad in his turbid flesh, serves God, how much greater is he than I?" The scroll of the Torah. Once a new Torah scroll was being dedicated in the house of prayer. Rabbi David Moshe held it in his hands and rejoiced in it. But since it was large and obviously very heavy, one of his Hasidim went up to him and wanted to relieve him of it. "Once you hold it," said the rabbi, "it isn't heavy anymore." The natural way. Rabbi David Moshe once asked after one of his Hasidim who was in great straits and in need of the help of God. The rabbi wanted to know whether that help had been accorded him. He was told that that was not the case, and that the nature of his trouble was such, it was hardly possible to imagine that help could come in a natural way. "Most likely the man has not perfect faith," said the Tzaddik. When he saw that the Hasidim did not understand him, he continued, "At first glance, it seems as though there were no reason to separate the natural way from the supernatural. This event was sent by God, and that other too was sent by God, so why make a distinction? But the distinction is real nevertheless. You know, when the world was created, the flood of light was so unbounded that the world could not bear it, and the vessels broke, and so the light was limited in order that it might be received and contained. And that is the meaning of the natural way, the limiting of the abundance into the bounded measure of the vessels. Now such a vessel is the readiness of man, and the readiness of man is faith. But just as all men have not the same faith, and no man has the same faith at all times, so the bounds of the natural way differ. He whose faith is stronger, whose vessel is more spacious, is accorded a greater measure of the natural way, for that way reaches to the bounds of faith. Yesterday, when your faith was small, you had to seek the help you had need of beyond nature. But today your faith has grown great, and so all the help you are accorded is possible by the natural way. This is the meaning of what is told of Nachshon. the son of Aminadab. When Israel stood by the Red Sea, he leaped into the waters before they were divided. And when they reached his throat, he said, "Save me, O God, for the waters are come in even unto the soul." He did not cry aloud. He spoke in a gentle voice, for his faith was great, and so everything that took place was natural. Praise of this generation. Once on the 8th day of the Feast of Booths, there was great rejoicing at the table of the rabbi of Chortkov. He laughed and asked, "Why are you people so exceedingly happy? Have you had a drop to drink?" "There hasn't been time to drink," they replied. "We stayed in the house of prayer for a long time, and then we came straight to the rabbi's table. We are just happy because of the festival, and because we are with our rabbi. It is true," said he, "that the moment the people of Israel feel the least bit of revelation, they are filled with an overwhelming joy." And after a while, he went on, "I say that this generation of ours, from whom God hides in great secrecy, is better than the wilderness generation. They were vouchsafed that great revelation, of which a serving maid, so it is told, saw more than the prophet Ezekiel saw later on, and they had tremendous spiritual powers, and their master was Moses. But now God is hidden, and our strength is slight, and yet the moment we sense the least bit of revelation, we are uplifted and full of joy. That is why I say, this generation is better than the wilderness generation." From the school of Rabbi Shmelke of Nikolsburg. Moshe Leib of Sasov. By night. In his youth, Moshe Leib sometimes secretly changed his dress of an evening, left the house unobserved, and shared in the amusements of some young men of his own age, singing and dancing with them. They all loved him, and his most casual word was their law, yet he never commanded them. When he went to Nikolsburg to study with Rabbi Shmelke, they gave up their revelry, because without him they took no pleasure in it. After many years, one of them who had been traveling in foreign lands stopped in Sasov on his way home. In the inn and on the street, everyone he talked to told him about a wonderful man, the great Tzaddik, Moshe Leib. When he heard the name, which was quite a common one, it did not occur to him that this could be his companion in the delights of days gone by, but his curiosity got the better of him. He went to the rabbi and instantly recognized him, and the thought crossed his mind, My, he is certainly an adept at deceiving the world." But as he looked into Rabbi Moshe Leib's face, a face he knew so well, and that yet commanded his reverence, he realized the implication of his memories, and suddenly understood that in those nights he and his friends had been guided without knowing it, and that time and again their celebrations had been uplifted under the influence of a law they could not grasp. He bowed before the Tzaddik, who was regarding him with kindness, and said, "Master, I thank you." The rod. Moshe Leib's father was bitterly opposed to the Hasidic way. When he learned that Moshe Leib had left the house without his knowledge and gone to Rabbi Shmelke's house of study in Nikolsburg, he flew into a rage. He cut a vicious rod and kept it in his room against his son's return. Whenever he saw a more suitable twig on a tree, he cut a new rod, which he thought would be more effective, and threw the old one away. Time passed, and many rods were exchanged. In the course of a thorough house cleaning, a servant once took the rod up to the attic. Soon afterward, Moshe Leib asked his teacher's leave to absent himself for a short while and went home. When he saw his father jump at sight of him and start on a furious search, he went straight up to the attic, fetched the rod, and laid it down in front of the old man. The latter gazed into the grave and loving face of his son and was won over. The Kalat. Moshe Leib spent 7 years in the house of study of the holy Rabbi Shmelke of Nikolsburg. When the 7 years were up, the rabbi summoned him and said nothing but, "Now you may go home." Then he gave him 3 things to take with him: a ducat, a loaf of bread, and the kind of long white robe that is called kalat. And he added, "May the love of Israel enter your heart." Moshe Leib walked all day and grew very tired. In the evening, as he approached a village where he intended to eat his bread and pass the night, he heard the sound of groaning and found that it came from behind a barred cellar window. He went up to it, spoke to the person inside, and soon learned that it was a Jewish innkeeper who had been imprisoned because he had not been able to pay his 300 gulden rent to the lord of the estate. The first thing Moshe Leib did was to throw his loaf of bread through the bars. Then, without asking the way, just as though he were at home in that region, he made straight for the manor house, asked to be taken to the Lord, and requested him to release the Jew. He offered his ducat as ransom. The manor lord merely looked over this impudent fellow who was attempting to settle a debt of 300 gulden with a ducat, and sent him packing. But the instant Moshe Leib was outside, he was so overcome with the suffering of the imprisoned Jew that he burst in at the door again and cried, "But you must let him go! Take my ducat and let the man go free!" Now in those days, every lord in the state of Poland was a king on his own estate and had the power of life and death. So the Lord ordered his servants to seize Moshe Leib and throw him into the kennel. And because Moshe Leib saw death in the eyes of the dogs who rushed at him, he quickly put on his white kalat, so as to die in a festive robe. But at sight of the kalat, the dogs backed toward the wall and howled. When the Lord entered the kennel, Moshe Leib was still leaning close to the door, and the dogs stood around in a wide circle, howling and shivering. He was told to get out and be off, but Moshe Leib insisted, "Not until you take my ducat and let the man go free." Then the Lord took the ducat and himself went to the house where the Jew was imprisoned, opened the cellar door, and bade the man go home in peace. And Moshe Leib continued his journey. The rabbi of Chortkov loved to tell this story, and when he had finished, he always added, "Oh, where can that kind of kalat be found? A Jew lives here." When Moshe Leib visited Rabbi Elimelech for the first time, his host honored him at the Sabbath meal by asking him to say Torah. Now on this particular Sabbath, the passage of the scriptures to be read dealt with God smiting the Egyptians and passing over the houses of the Israelites. Moshe Leib said, "This cannot possibly mean that God passed over a certain place, because there is no place where he is not. But when he passed through the Egyptians' houses and saw the corruption of their souls, and then came to a house full of piety and goodness, he was overjoyed and cried, 'A Jew lives here.'" When Rabbi Elimelech heard this explanation, he jumped on the table, danced upon it, and sang over and over, "A Jew lives here, a Jew lives here." When you come home. When Moshe Leib was young, he and his wife and children lived in great poverty. One of his neighbors who wished him well offered him a sum of money so that he might ride to market, buy goods, and sell them in his hometown. Rabbi Moshe Leib rode to market with the other dealers. When they arrived at their destination, they all attended to their business, but he went to the house of study. When he left it and went to the marketplace, without realizing how many hours had passed, they were just getting ready to start for home. And when he said he wanted to buy some goods, they laughed at him. So he went home with the rest. His children were waiting for him in front of his house and called, "What did you bring us?" At these words, he fainted. Just as Moshe Leib regained consciousness, the well-to-do neighbor arrived to inquire how he had made out. He saw how wretched Moshe Leib looked and asked, "What's the matter, Rabbi? Have you lost the money? But don't let that worry you. I'll give you more." Rabbi Moshe Leib only said, "Oh, what shall I do if in the future I come home and they ask, 'What have you brought us?'" "Well, if that's the way it is," said the neighbor, "you had better carry on your business at home." After this, he made known to the world that Rabbi Moshe Leib was a Tzaddik. How long? Long after Rabbi Moshe Leib's death, his son, Rabbi Shmelka of Sasov, was asked to tell about his father. He said, "He died when I was still a boy, and at that time I did not have the understanding to grasp his actions. But there is something I can tell you anyway. I must have been about 5 years old. It was New Year's and my father was praying at the reader's desk. I had crept under his prayer shawl and heard how in the middle of his low-voiced prayer of benedictions, he complained to God in the half-coaxing, half-affectionate tone of a child, and the language used by the common people. He said something like this, 'Dear God, please send us the Messiah sometime.' How long are you going to let us suffer in the dark exile? We can't stand it anymore." How a thief instructed the Rabbi of Sasov. The Rabbi of Sasov once traveled about trying to collect money to ransom persons in the debtor's prison, but he did not succeed in getting together the sum he needed. Then he regretted having wasted time he might have spent studying and praying, and resolved that henceforth he would stay home. On the same day, he heard that a Jew who had stolen an article of clothing had been soundly beaten and put in jail. Rabbi Moshe Leib interceded with the judge and gained the thief's release. When the Tzaddik went to fetch the thief from jail, he warned him, "Remember the beating they gave you, and don't ever do anything like that again." "Why not?" said the thief. "If you don't succeed the first time, you may succeed the next." "If that's the case," said the rabbi to himself, "then I must keep trying at my job too." Interruption. One midnight, when Rabbi Moshe Leib was absorbed in the mystic teachings, he heard a knock at his window. A drunken peasant stood outside and asked to be let in and given a bed for the night. For a moment, the Tzaddik's heart was full of anger, and he said to himself, "How can a drunk have the insolence to ask to be let in? And what business has he in this house?" But then he said silently in his heart, "And what business has he in God's world? But if God gets along with him, can I reject him?" He opened the door at once and prepared a bed. Imitatio Dei. The Rabbi of Sasov once gave the last money he had in his pocket to a man of ill repute. His disciples threw it up to him. He answered them, "Shall I be more finicky than God, who gave it to me?" How the Rabbi of Sasov learned how to love Rabbi Moshe Leib told this story. How to love men is something I learned from a peasant. He was sitting in an inn along with other peasants, drinking. For a long time he was as silent as all the rest, but when he was moved by the wine, he asked one of the men seated beside him, "Tell me, do you love me or don't you love me?" The other replied, "I love you very much." But the first peasant replied, "You say that you love me, but you do not know what I need. If you really loved me, you would know." The other had not a word to say to this, and the peasant who had put the question fell silent again. But I understood. To know the needs of men and to bear the burden of their sorrow, that is the true love of men. His own suffering. Whenever the Rabbi of Sasov saw anyone suffering, either of spirit or of body, he shared it so earnestly that the other's suffering became his own. Once someone expressed his astonishment at this capacity to share in another's troubles. "What do you mean share?" said the rabbi. "It is my own sorrow. How can I help but suffer it?" At the fair, Rabbi Moshe Leib used to go to the fair and keep a sharp lookout for anyone who might need his help. On one such occasion, the traders had left the stalls to watch the performance of a troupe of jugglers or some other spectacle, and their cattle remained in the marketplace, untended. The calves were thirsty and hung their heads. When the rabbi noticed this, he took a bucket and watered the animals as if that had been his job all his life. Just then one of the traders returned, and when he saw a man tending the cattle of the others, he asked him to see to his cattle too. They were standing in one of the side streets, he said, and he wouldn't argue over the cattle tender's fee. The rabbi obeyed and stayed on his job until he had finished. The love of man. The Rabbi of Sasov used to visit all the sick boys in the town, sit at their bedside, and nurse and take care of them. Once he said, "He who is not willing to suck the pus from the sore of a child sick with the plague has not climbed even halfway up the mountain to the love of his fellow men." The delay. On the eve of the Day of Atonement, when the time had come to say Kol Nidre, all the Hasidim were gathered together in the house of prayer, waiting for the rabbi. But time passed, and he did not come. Then one of the women of the congregation said to herself, "I guess it will be quite a while before they begin, and I was in such a hurry and my child is alone in the house. I'll just run home and look after it to make sure it hasn't awakened. I can be back in a few minutes." She ran home and listened at the door. Everything was quiet. Softly, she turned the knob and put her head into the room, and there stood the rabbi, holding her child in his arms. He had heard the child crying on his way to the house of prayer, and had played with it and sung to it until it fell asleep. Lamentations at midnight. Rabbi Moshe Leib was unusually tall and broad, but a protracted disease was sapping his strength. However, even when he had retired exhausted with pain, he rose from his bed every midnight, left his room wide awake and with a firm step, and recited the lamentation over Jerusalem. That was why his Hasidim said that the words in the Song of Songs, "Hark, my beloved knocketh," applied to him, for it was clear that the voice of the mournful divine presence was knocking at his heart and waking him. Rabbi Hirsch of Zaydachov had heard of the Rabbi of Sasov's strange doings at midnight. Once, when he was a guest in his house, he hid so that he might watch him. At midnight he saw the Rabbi of Sasov put on peasant's dress, go into the snow-covered yard, fetch a load of wood out of the cellar, lash the logs together, and hoist them on his back. Then he walked away, and Rabbi Hirsch followed him in the crackling cold of the winter night to the end of the town. There, Rabbi Moshe stopped in front of a miserable hut and unloaded the wood. His disciple crept up to a back window and looked into a bare room. The stove was out. On the bed lay a woman pressing a newborn child to her breast with a gesture of utter despair. But at that moment, the Rabbi of Sasov entered the room. Rabbi Hirsch saw him go up to the woman and heard him address her in Ruthenian. "I have a load of wood for sale and don't want to carry it any further. Will you buy it at a bargain price?" The woman answered, "I haven't a penny in the house." But the rabbi refused to be put off. "I'll come back for the money some other time," he said, "if you'll just take the wood." The woman objected. "What shall I do with the wood? I can't chop it up myself, and there isn't an axe anyway." The Rabbi of Sasov replied, "You just let me take care of that," left the room, took his axe, and chopped the wood into small pieces. And while he was chopping, Rabbi Hirsch heard him reciting that part of the Lamentations at midnight associated with the name of our mother Rachel. He caught the words, "Shake thyself from the dust, arise and sit down, O Jerusalem." Then the rabbi took the wood, stooped in order to enter through the low door, and made a fire in the stove. While he put in the wood, he softly recited the other part of the Lamentations, associated with the name of our mother Leah, and ended with, "Thou wilt arise and have compassion upon Zion. Build thou Jerusalem." Then he left the room and went home, walking very quickly. Below and above. The Rabbi of Sasov was entertaining two singers at his house. Their singing was excellent, but as is so often the case with singers, they were mischievous fellows. Once his wife put some coffee on the table for him, but while he was getting ready, the two of them drank it up and filled the pot with water. His wife did not have another warm drink to serve him, for things were none too plentiful in that house. She grew very angry at the ne'er-do-wells and cried, "What do you need singers for? All they give you is trouble," he said. "Their beautiful songs waken my heart so that I can hear the angels sing." God and man. A woman who lived next door to Rabbi Moshe Leib lost one child after another before they were a year old. Once, when she was in the Tzaddik's house, she cried aloud, "A God who gives you children just to take them away again is not good. He is a cruel God." Rabbi Leib's wife scolded her. "That's no way to talk. What you should say is, we cannot fathom God's mercy, and what he does is well done." "Oh no," said the rabbi, who heard them talking from where he sat in his room and came out to join them. "You must not be resigned. Take courage, woman, and take strength. A year from now you will have a son, and in time to come I shall lead him under the bridal canopy." And so it was. When it is good to deny the existence of God, Rabbi Moshe Leib said, "There is no quality and there is no power of man that was created to no purpose, and even base and corrupt qualities can be uplifted to serve God. When, for example, haughty self-assurance is uplifted, it changes into a high assurance in the ways of God. But to what end can the denial of God have been created? This too can be uplifted through deeds of charity. For if someone comes to you and asks your help, You shall not turn him off with pious words, saying, "Have faith, and take your troubles to God." You shall act as if there were no God, as if there were only one person in all the world who could help this man, only yourself. Pouring the mead. Rabbi Chaim of Lizhensk told this story. When I was a little under 3, a great fire broke out in Brody, the town where I was born, and my nurse took me and fled to Sasov. She stayed there with me over the last days of the Feast of Booths. Now, on the day of rejoicing in the law, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov was in the habit of going to the marketplace together with his entire congregation. This time, too, tables and benches had been set up, and they all sat around the tables while the rabbi, blessed be his memory, took a pitcher of mead, walked from one to the other, and poured. The women came to the marketplace to watch, and on this occasion my nurse joined them, carrying me in her arms. The rabbi said, "The women shall stand to one side," and they did so, my nurse along with them. At that I craned my head across my nurse's shoulder and watched. I watched carefully, and I still know everything I saw. A Tzaddik who was among his listeners asked, "Does the rabbi really remember how he craned his head across his nurse's shoulder?" Rabbi Chaim replied, "It was imposed on me to remember, for I had got a beautiful little soul, and if I had not spoiled it later on, it would have amounted to something. So I was given this memory to keep on my way." The Dance of Healing. News was brought to Rabbi Moshe Leib that his friend, the rabbi of Berdichev, had fallen ill. On the Sabbath, he said his name over and over and prayed for his recovery. Then he put on new shoes, made of Morocco leather, laced them up tight, and danced. A Tzaddik who was present said, "Power flowed forth from his dancing. Every step was a powerful mystery. An unfamiliar light suffused the house, and everyone watching saw the heavenly hosts join in his dance." The Bridal Dance. A Hasid related, "I was at the wedding of Rabbi Moshe Leib's grandson, and there were many guests. When they formed the ring for the bridal dance, a man in a short peasant's smock, with a short peasant's pipe in his mouth, suddenly leaped into the ring and danced alone in the very middle. I was just about to take him by the sleeve, for I thought he must be out of his mind to break into a circle of Tzadikim. But when I saw them all watching him in silence, I let him be. After the dance, I found out that it was the rabbi." This is the time to dance. A Tzaddik who was near death got up and danced, and when those around him tried to get him to stop, he said, "This is the time to dance." Then he related, when Rabbi Uri of Strelisk was traveling around to collect money for some charitable purpose, he called on the rabbi of Sasov. "I have no money," said the rabbi, "but I'll dance a bit for you." He danced the whole night through, and Rabbi Uri did not take his eyes off him, for in every step was a holy meaning. When morning dawned, Rabbi Moshe Leib said, "Now I'll go and collect some money in the marketplaces and streets." He left and did not return until after 2 days. When they asked him where he had been, he said, "When I was young, I once needed money to ransom prisoners and started out to collect it with a boy who was to show me where the rich people lived. The boy did his job so cleverly and well that I soon had the required sum. Because of this, I promised him that I should once dance at his wedding. Now when I arrived in Zlachov, I heard the sound of gay music, followed it, and learned that the boy I had traveled with was celebrating his wedding. And so I danced and made merry with the merry until now. And that is why I say." The Tzaddik who was telling the story added, "When they come to you with a demand, it is time to dance." How the rabbi of Sasov helped a woman bear her child. The story is told. In a certain village, a woman had been lying in labor for days, and the hour of her delivery would not come. They sent a messenger to the rabbi of Sasov to ask him to beg God to have mercy on her. At dead of night, the man arrived in the city where he knew no one, not even the Tzaddik, and could not find his way in the dark. Only one house was still lit. The messenger knocked. An old man opened the door, poured him a glass of brandy to refresh him, and asked why he had come. When he heard the cause of the journey, he said, "It is too late to go there now. You just sleep here, and in the morning I'll take you to the rabbi." He gave him something to eat and prepared a bed for him. The man woke up early in the morning and was sorry that he had given in to his own weariness and the words of the old man, and postponed his pressing errand. Just then his host came up to him and said, "Be of good cheer. I have just learned that the woman has given birth to a healthy boy. Go to the nearby villages and tell her relatives." When the man was outside the house, he discovered from the questions people asked him that he had been a guest of the rabbi, but he did not venture to go back in. The way of life. Rabbi Moshe Leib said, "The way in this world is like the edge of a blade. On this side is the netherworld, and on that side is the netherworld, and the way of life lies in between." An hour. Rabbi Moshe Leib said, "A human being who has not a single hour for his own every day is no human being." Depending on God. Rabbi Moshe Leib said, "How easy it is for a poor man to depend on God. What else has he to depend on? And how hard it is for a rich man to depend on God. All his possessions call out to him, 'Depend on us.'" Generations. The Rabbi of Rizhin related, "Once, when the holy Baal Shem Tov wanted to save the life of a sick boy he was very much attached to, he ordered a candle made of pure wax, carried it to the woods, fastened it to a tree, and lit it. Then he pronounced a long prayer. The candle burned all night. When morning came, the boy was well. When my grandfather, the great Maggid, who was the holy Baal Shem's disciple, wanted to work a like cure, he no longer knew the secret meaning of the words on which he had to concentrate. He did as his master had done and called on his name, and his efforts met with success. When Rabbi Moshe Leib, the disciple of the great Maggid, wanted to work a cure of this kind, he said, "We have no longer the power even to do what was done, but I shall relate the story of how it was done, and God will help." And his efforts met with success. The love of Israel. Rabbi Moshe Leib wanted most earnestly to acquire only one of all the virtues of his teacher, Rabbi Shmelka of Nikolsburg, his love of Israel. And he did acquire it, and in abundance. For when he fell very ill and lay on his bed for 2.5 years, racked with pain, he grew more and more certain that he was suffering for the sake of Israel, and his pain did not grow less, but it was transfigured. The wedding tune. Once Rabbi Moshe Leib married off 2 orphans and saw to it that they did not feel deserted on their wedding day. When the 2 young people stood under the bridal canopy, the rabbi's face was transfigured with radiance, for at that moment he felt himself a father twice over. He listened to the tune the musicians were playing. Then he said to the people standing around him, "I wish it were vouchsafed me to go to my eternal home on the day destined to the sound of this tune, the Konstavoti." After many years, when this hour and these words were long forgotten, a number of musicians were traveling to play at a wedding in Brody on a snowy winter's day. Suddenly the horses began to pull harder and broke into a rapid trot. The driver could not slow them up. They went faster and faster, jolted the sleigh worse and worse, and ran unerringly toward some goal. They finally stopped at a cemetery. The musicians saw many people gathered there and asked where they were and who was being buried. When they heard the name of Rabbi Moshe Leib, they remembered how years ago, when they were young, they had played before him at the wedding of the 2 orphans. And now, the people too recalled the incident, and they all cried, "Play the wedding tune." After death. It is told, when Rabbi Moshe Leib had died, he said to himself, "Now I am free from fulfilling the commandments. What can I do now that will be in obedience to the will of God?" He thought for a while. "It must surely be God's will that I be punished for my countless sins." And immediately he began to run with all his might and jumped straight into hell. Heaven was very much perturbed at this, and soon the prince of hell was told not to stoke his fires while the rabbi of Sasov was down there. Thereupon the prince begged the Tzaddik to take himself off to paradise, for this was clearly not the place for him. It just would not do to call a holiday in hell for his sake. "If that is the case," said Moshe Leib, "I won't stir from here until all the souls are allowed to go with me. On earth I made it my business to ransom prisoners, and so I certainly will not let this big crowd suffer in this prison." And they say that he had his way. The Dancing Bear. Some guests who had attended the wedding of the daughter of Rabbi Shmelki of Sasov, who was Rabbi Moshe Leib's son, paid a visit to Rabbi Meir of Primishlan on their way home. He questioned them eagerly as to what special thing they had seen at the celebration, refused to be satisfied with what they told him, and kept on asking, "And what else happened?" Finally, they said, while the traditional dances with the bride and groom were going on, an enormous man completely disguised as a bear leaped into the circle and did a most magnificent bear's dance. Everybody marveled at his really wonderful bounds, and there was a great clapping of hands. And then, just as suddenly as he had come, he was gone. No one knew him. "I'll tell you," said Rabbi Meir. "That was none other than our holy teacher, Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov. May his memory help us, who came down from the uppermost paradise to rejoice with his family." His heart. Once Rabbi Bunam was asked, "Have you ever known a Tzaddik whose heart was broken and crushed, and yet sound and whole?" Rabbi Bunam replied, "Yes, I did know such a Tzaddik. It was Rabbi Moshe Leib of Sasov." He who lives forever. The hour before he died, Rabbi Shmelk of Sasov saw his father Rabbi Moshe Leib and his great teacher Rabbi Mikal, the Maggid of Zlachov, standing beside him. Then he began to sing the hymn, "Glory and faithfulness are his who lives forever." When he came to the verse, "Cognition and expression are his who lives forever," he stopped singing and said, "When a man approaches his end, when the power of expression and the power of cognition are being taken from him, he shall give these two, cognition and expression, to him who lives forever." End quote. Menahem Mendel of Kosov and Hayim of Kosov. Wherefore? Once when they asked Rabbi Mendel of Kosov with great insistence, "Why doesn't the Messiah come?" he replied, "It is written, wherefore did the son of Jesse not come, neither yesterday nor today? Why does he not come? Because today we are no different from what we were yesterday." Destroying a man. A deputation came to Rabbi Mendel of Kosov to complain of a certain slaughterer in their town. After they had enumerated a long list of misdeeds, the people asked the Tzaddik to relieve this objectionable person of his office. But one who had come along with the rest disputed their testimony, saying that it was slander and sprang from hatred. Rabbi Mendel decided in favor of the slaughterer. The others reproached him bitterly because he had believed the words of one single man and ignored the majority. "The scriptures relate," he said, "that God bade Abraham offer his son as a burnt offering, and Abraham prepared to obey. But an angel stopped him, and instantly he heeded the angel's voice, even though God had not himself revoked his command. What the Torah teaches us thereby is this: none but God can command us to destroy a man. And if the very smallest angel comes after the command has been given and cautions us, 'Lay not thy hand upon,' we must obey him." The right kind of help. Among Rabbi Mendel's Hasidim was a man by the name of Rabbi Moshe, who was both well-to-do and fond of doing good deeds. And then the wheel of fortune turned, to use a popular phrase, and he lost all his money and fell into debt. He went to the Tzaddik and told him about his predicament. "Go to my brother-in-law, the Seraph of Strelisk," said Rabbi Mendel, "and pour your heart out to him." The man did so. When Rabbi Uri of Strelisk had heard his story, he said, "I shall take the bath of immersion for you, and the merit of this bath will accrue to your benefit." The man returned to his master and reported what had happened. "Go back to my brother-in-law," said the rabbi of Kosov, "and say to him, 'The bath of immersion will not serve to pay my creditors.'" The man rode to Strelisk a second time and said what he had been told to. "Very well, my son," the seraph replied. "In that case, I shall also dedicate to your welfare the merit of the phylacteries which I shall put on today." When the man repeated this in Kosof, Rabbi Mendel said, "Give my brother-in-law this message from me. The phylacteries can't get rid of tormentors either." The man did as he was bidden. The seraph reflected. "Well," said he, "if that is the case, I shall do my utmost for you. I shall dedicate to you the merit of all the prayers I say today, and thus from this hour on, the three merits will unite in giving you help." Rabbi Moshe returned to Kosof and gave his report. "Go," said the Tzaddik, and he spoke as softly as always, only more slowly. And when he spoke slowly, the effect on those who were listening was greater than if he had raised his voice. "Go, speak to my brother-in-law in my name, and say, all this will not settle a single debt." When the seraph received this message, he immediately put on his fur coat and set out for Kosof. The moment he arrived at his brother-in-law's, he asked, "What do you want of me?" "What I want," said Rabbi Mendel, "is for both of us to travel around for a number of weeks and collect money from our people. For it is written, 'Thou shalt uphold him,' and that is what they did." The snuff box. Once when Rabbi David of Zablotov, the son of Rabbi Mendel of Kosof, was visiting Rabbi Zevi Hirsch in Zhaidachov, he happened to pull his snuff box out of his pocket to take a pinch. Hardly had Rabbi Hirsch laid eyes on the box when he asked, "Where did you get that?" "From my father," said Rabbi David. "This box," said the Rabbi of Zhaidachov, "conjures up for me the tent of meeting, and it conjures up all the secret holy meanings which Bezalel the builder had in mind when he put up the tent of meeting." Rabbi David replied, "They told me this about my father. When he had this box made, he gave the silversmith a piece of solid silver and told him exactly what to do. He even told him how many times he was to strike with his hammer, just so many and no more. And he stood by the entire time and saw to it that everything was done just as he said. Now everything is perfectly clear," said the Rabbi of Zhaidachov. The gift to his adversary. A Jew from Kosof, who was known to be opposed to the Hasidic way, once came to Rabbi Mendel and complained that he was about to marry off his daughter and did not have the money for her dowry. He begged the rabbi for advice on how to earn the sum he needed. "How much do you need?" asked the rabbi. It came to a few hundred gulden. Rabbi Mendel opened a drawer in his desk, emptied it, and gave the money to the man. Soon after, the Tzaddik's brother learned what had occurred. He came and took the Tzaddik to task, saying that whenever something was needed in his own house, he said he had no money to spare. Yet now he had given such a large sum to an adversary. "Someone was here before you," said Rabbi Mendel, "and said exactly the same thing, except that he expressed himself much better than you." "Who was it?" asked his brother. Rabbi Mendel replied, "It was Satan." Dancing and pain. On every Sabbath eve, Rabbi Chaim of Kosof, the son of Rabbi Mendel, danced before his assembled disciples. His face was aflame, and they all knew that every step was informed with sublime meanings and affected sublime things. Once while he was in the midst of dancing, a heavy bench fell on his foot, and he had to pause because of the pain. Later they asked him about it. "It seems to me," he said, "that the pain made itself felt because I interrupted the dance." In every generation. One evening, several of Rabbi Chaim of Kosof's Hasidim sat together in his house of study and told one another stories about Tzadikim, above all, about the Baal Shem Tov. And because both the telling and the listening were very sweet to them, they were at it even after midnight. Then one of them told still another story about the Baal Shem Tov. When he had ended, another sighed from the bottom of his heart. "Alas," said he, half to himself, "where could we find such a man today?" At that instant, they heard steps coming down the wooden stair which led from the Tzaddik's room. The door opened, and Rabbi Chaim appeared on the threshold, in the short jacket he usually wore in the evening. "Fools," he said softly, "he is present in every generation. He, the Baal Shem Tov, only that in those days he was manifest, while now he is hidden." He closed the door and went back up the stair. The Hasidim sat together in silence. Yitzhak Isaac of Kalev. The Song of the Goose Boy. Rabbi Leib, the son of Sarah, the roving Tzaddik who never stayed in one place for any length of time, was always on the search for souls, the souls of the dead, which longed for redemption, and living souls, which needed to be discovered and uplifted. The story goes that once, when he was in the north of Russia, he heard of a holy soul in the south of Hungary, which was hiding rather than becoming manifest in the body of a boy. He immediately set out on one of his wonderfully swift journeys. When he arrived in the little town he had been told of, he prayed in the house of prayer, and then went into the adjoining wood and walked until he came to a clearing which was threaded by a stream. There he found a boy of about 8, walking slowly along the bank with eyes and ears only for his flock, which obeyed his every whistle and gesture. Rabbi Leib followed unobserved, and soon the boy began to hum a little song, repeating the few words over and over. Shekhinah, Shekhinah, how far, Galut, Galut, how endless you are. But if the Galut were taken away, we could be together, to stay. After listening for a while, Rabbi Leib approached the boy and asked him where he had learned his song. Why, all the herdsmen here sing it, answered the boy. Do they really sing those words? The Tzaddik insisted. Well, said the boy, they say beloved instead of Shekhinah, and wood instead of Galut. But that's just stupid. For who could our beloved be if not the Shekhinah? And every child knows that the wood which separates us from her is the Galut. So why not say so in the first place? Then Rabbi Leib went with the boy and his flock of geese to the poor widow who was his mother, and offered to take her son with him, and see to it that he grew up to be a rabbi. He brought him to Rabbi Shmelka of Nikolsburg, and the boy grew up in his house of study. Rabbi Shmelka's melodies formed his soul, but to the end of his days he sang to himself the songs of the Hungarian herdsman, changing only a word here and there. Miriam's well. This story was told by a grandson of Jacob Fish, a man both rich and devout, whom the Baal Shem had blessed with both hands and wished a very long life, and who actually lived to the age of 113 years, his face remaining youthful to the day of his death. My grandfather's estate was close to the town of Kalev. Once in the late afternoon before the Day of Atonement, when everybody was already assembled in the house of prayer, wearing shrouds and reciting the prayer of purity with much weeping, the rabbi of Kalev called my grandfather and said to him, Rabbi Jacob, have your horses harnessed. Let us go for a drive. My grandfather was very much surprised, but since he was well acquainted with the Tzaddik's ways, he said nothing, but sent word home to have the carriage brought around. They got in and drove across my grandfather's fields. In one place, there was a narrow body of water. Quickly, the rabbi took off his clothes and immersed himself again and again. My grandfather stood beside him and did not know what to do. But the Tzaddik was already putting on his clothes. They drove straight to the house of prayer, and the Tzaddik went up to the reader's desk. My grandfather could not get over his amazement, for never before had he seen any water in that place in his fields. When the Day of Atonement was over, he went back there and looked around, but nowhere could he find a trace of the stream. Then he went to the Tzaddik and said, Rabbi, you know that I never ask you about your own concerns, but now I beg you to explain to me what happened. Rabbi Jacob, answered the Tzaddik, if Miriam's well, which accompanied Israel in the wilderness, comes through our part of the country unexpectedly, why in the world do you just stand there instead of immersing yourself in it along with me? Immersion without water. Once on the afternoon before the Day of Atonement, when the time for the ritual bath had come, the rabbi of Kalev went to the stream near which the town is situated, but instead of immersing himself in it, he lay down on the grassy bank and said, Oh, what a good place to sleep. When it was almost evening, and the Hasidim, who had accompanied him, had all dipped down in the stream, he awoke and stretched. Then, without immersing himself, but looking and moving as though he were quickened with new life, as he always appeared after the bath, he returned to the town with the rest. Enduring pain. From youth until old age, Rabbi Yitzhak Isaac suffered from an ailment which was known to involve very great pain. His physician once asked him how he managed to endure such pain without complaining or groaning. He replied, "You would understand that readily enough if you thought of the pain as scrubbing and soaking the soul in a strong solution. Since this is so, one cannot do otherwise than accept such pain with love and not grumble. After a time, one gains the strength to endure the present pain. It is always only the question of a moment, for the pain which has passed is no longer present, and who would be so foolish as to concern himself with future pain?" Like lie. One Sabbath, after Rabbi Yitzhak Isaac had sung the song, "When I the Sabbath Keep," which contains the words, "That is why I wash my heart like lye," he paused and said, "One does not wash lye, one washes with lye." Then he replied to his own objection, "But the holiness of the Holy Sabbath can make a heart so pure that it becomes strong enough to purify other hearts, as lye purifies objects." The disciple who related this incident, later when he had become a Tzaddik, told his own Hasidim, "Do you know how I became a Jew? My teacher, the holy Rabbi of Kalev, took the soul out of my body and soaped and beat it, and rinsed it and dried it and rolled it, like women washing clothes at a brook, and then he put this cleansed soul back into me. And the fire abated." The tale is told. The Rabbi of Kalev once spent the Sabbath in a nearby village as the guest of one of the Hasidim. When the hour to receive the Sabbath had come, someone suddenly screamed, and a servant rushed in and cried that the barn in which the grain was stored was on fire. The owner wanted to run out, but the rabbi took him by the hand. "Stay," he said. "I'm going to tell you a story." The Hasid stayed. "When our master, Rabbi Zusha, was young," said the Tzaddik, "he stoked the stoves in the house of the great Maggid, for this duty was always assigned to the youngest disciples. Once, when he was saying the Psalms with great fervor just before the coming of the Sabbath, he was startled by screams from within the house. Sparks had fallen from the stove which he had filled with wood, and since no one was in the living room, a fire had started. "Zusya," he was reproached. "There's a fire." "No matter," he replied. "Is it not written?" And the fire abated. At that very same moment, the fire abated. The Rabbi of Kalev fell silent. The Hasid, whom he still held by the hand, did not dare move. A moment passed, and someone called in at the window that the fire in the barn had gone out. The visit on the Seder evening. They tell this story. Rizel, the daughter of Rabbi Zevi Hirsch of Zhaidachov, who had married a son of the Rabbi of Kalev, lived with him in her father's house. Once they received an invitation to spend the Passover in Kalev. She was against it since she did not want to be absent from her father's Seder, but her husband kept urging her to accept, until finally she consented. The customs in her father-in-law's house were different from those she was familiar with. But what vexed her more than anything else was that the rabbi did not sit down at the table early on the Seder evening, as her father did, but walked back and forth in the room for a long time without saying a word. Suddenly he threw open the window. A carriage drawn by 2 great white horses stopped in front of the house. In it were 3 men and 4 women of princely appearance. The rabbi went out to them. They embraced and kissed him, exchanged a few words. Then the coachman cracked his whip and the carriage was gone. The rabbi re-entered the room, closed the window, and sat down at the table. Rizel did not dare to question him. When the festival was over and she was back home, she told her father all that had happened. "You must know," he instructed her, "that those were the patriarchs and the matriarchs." The holy rabbi did not want to sit down to the Seder before the advent of salvation, and he besieged the upper worlds with his prayers. And so the fathers and the mothers had to appear and tell him that the time was not yet come.